Before visiting the notary, Steve was visibly nervous, although he could not understand the real reason for his anxiety. The young orderly's heart began to beat like crazy at the mere thought that in a few minutes he would be read the will of a deceased patient who, for some inexplicable reason, had included him in her will. Did she really go for it after all? That's kind of weird. We never talked about it, Steve thought as he walked up the steps to the notary's office. He was in a bad mood. More than anything else, Steve was stressed about the situation itself. Where was he and where were the late millionaire's wills? What did he have to do with any of this? His job was a small one, working on the ward, helping sick patients, and there's no need for gratitude. Steve wasn't the kind of man to ask for money for his services. It's a job, and it's paid. To each his own. The notary was already waiting for him, and, glancing at the screen of his smartphone, said, "Have a seat, Steve. I've summoned you to read Smith Emma's will to you in strict secrecy." Steve looked into the notary's eyes with surprise. Secrecy? Are we playing spies here? Honestly, I don't get it at all. Is this some kind of joke? There was a tense silence in the office. Only the second hand of the wall clock was methodically counting the interval allotted for the conversation. The notary hesitated for a moment, but still answered his guest's question. "Steve, I certainly understand your surprise, but it was the late Emma who insisted on the conditions of secrecy, not me. So I suggest we get to the point." "Yes, of course, I don't mind," Steve agreed. The notary nodded and, putting on his horn-rimmed glasses, began. "According to Smith Emma's will, you receive a very sizable deposit in a bank opened in your name. I won't say the exact amount out loud, but I can write it down for you on a slip of paper." Steve's eyes widened in surprise. The notary smiled understandingly and then added, "But that's not all. Steve, after the announcement of the inheritance, you must perform one very delicate task." "What kind of task?" The notary didn't keep his client waiting and blurted out almost immediately. "You are to spend the night at the grave of the deceased Emma. Just a little item like this. The money is yours." "What, spend the night in a cemetery? Are you out of your mind? What kind of adventure is that? Is that really what it says in the will?" Steve couldn't help himself, and then he realized that the lawyer was innocent. And anyway, could he have supposed such a thing? Understanding the visitor's state of mind, the notary added, "According to the deceased's will, you are to report to the city cemetery no later than tomorrow. The details of the bank account are enclosed, and you'll receive them after you've fulfilled all the conditions. I must warn you, there is no way around the rules. You either strictly comply with them, or you don't. In the first case, you get a lot of money. In the second case, we part with you and, having shaken hands, safely forget about each other's existence. So it's up to you." Steve froze in amazement. What a piece of news. He'd been living his life without touching anyone. And then this happened. Why did this patient like him so much? To tell the truth, Steve didn't know what to say. It all sounded so strange, it took his breath away. A test of his abilities, a test of courage. But what normal person would spend the night in a graveyard? It was unthinkable. Steve's face immediately reflected everything he thought of as a perceptive man. The notary was able to read the signs better than other books in the past. Mr. Bierman worked in a court of law, where he occasionally encountered very interesting personalities, ranging from outright criminals to spouses filing for divorce. Deciding not to prolong the meeting, he summarized, "If there are no more questions, I dare not detain you, Steve." At the same time, the notary looked expressively into his guest's eyes, as if trying to hypnotize him and bend him to his will. Of course it was not so, and Mr. Bierman's characteristic look spoke of nothing wrong. Steve said a dry goodbye and left the office, which suddenly felt so cramped and stuffy. When he went outside, he enjoyed the fresh air and sat down on a nearby bench. The notary's words echoed in his head. A night in a cemetery. A night in the cemetery. A bank account. The condition voiced by the lawyer shocked the young orderly so much that he didn't know what to do next. Should he refuse the will? But he had done without large sums of money before, and nothing. But what about Dad? He's been wanting to save up for a power wheelchair for a long time. What if this is his chance? The thoughts swarmed in Steve's head like ants that couldn't stay still for a minute. His father was a trucker. Aiden had been in an accident caused by a driver who had drifted into the oncoming lane, and when he saw that the car was being driven by a woman with a teenager sitting next to her, he had swerved his steering wheel in the opposite direction. Although the collision was avoided, Aiden's multi-ton truck crashed into the ditch, trapping the unfortunate driver firmly in the cab. Fortunately, Steve's father was lucky and survived, but the injuries he sustained in the accident left him permanently confined to a wheelchair and unable to drive the truck, nor any other motorized transportation. That's when the dream of an electric wheelchair became Aiden's only goal in life. One day he even saved up the necessary amount of money, but by a cruel irony of fate, he became a victim of fraudsters who robbed his apartment, pretending to be employees of the local management company. Steve then just returned from work and found his father crying over an empty jewelry box where he kept all his modest savings. Why? Why did they take the last of it from me? Am I guilty of something? I never took a dime of someone else's money in my life, and I put my son on his feet all by myself, his father said through his tears. Steve clenched his fists painfully, knowing perfectly well that there was no one to punish anyway. Deceived a trusting invalid, put his guard down, but it was really a pity for his father. He had been saving money for a long time, and now what? The light in his eyes faded, and depression set in with renewed vigor. But how can you not be sad? Steve's mother passed away a long time ago. He'd been 7 years old at the time, a hereditary disease that followed all the women in his family. There was very little that could be done. Chemotherapy sessions and expensive treatments were useless. Steve had been raised by his father ever since. Aiden was never able to get together with anyone else. After the accident, it was out of the question. What kind of family? Steve did his best to support his father. Recently, he started saving money again to buy him the very same electric wheelchair. But the prices were getting higher and higher. Aiden himself became sick more often, which meant that part of the family budget was spent on medicines. To get out of this situation, Steve often took part-time jobs on the side for a small fee, helping those who needed it. But when he saw that a person could barely make ends meet, he did everything for free and flatly refused to charge anything for it. His partner in the department only laughed, calling him a wizard in a white coat. But Steve only joked, "What kind of wizard am I? I would be a wizard if I could get into medical school." But that's just not me. Everyone knew that Steve failed the entrance exams because he lacked only a few points. About the true cause of his fiasco, young orderly preferred not to spread.
In fact, Steve did not pass the exams by pure chance, deciding to help one applicant with the answer to a very difficult question. As it happened, it was the ticket he knew best. It was probably a mistake, because of helping another person he could not fully answer his own question. In order not to waste time, after failing the exams, Steve went to medical school, hoping to enter the university the next year.
But life had its own way, and after Aiden was in a car accident, the dreams of higher education were in the past for Steve. The work of an orderly in the surgical department was difficult, and not everyone could withstand it for more than 6 months. Potential low-level workers needed to have a strong psyche, not bad physical shape, as well as possess a set of necessary medical knowledge. Steve had all this in abundance, although he himself had dreamed of becoming a doctor since childhood. True, not a surgeon, but a therapist. But what difference does it make now? For some inexplicable reason, the head of the department disliked Steve at first sight and emphasized it in every possible way, both in conversation and at the meeting. The orderly himself tried to behave with emphasized politeness and never interrupted. Most likely, there was something in him that could be felt even at a distance, and the experienced chief immediately realized that Steve is too willful to devote him to all the secrets of the department. And this good in surgery was enough with plenty, and was primarily associated with paid wards, which the head of the department organized with the approval of the management of the clinic. Steve himself never divided patients into poor or rich. For him, they were all equal. An infirm grandmother, living from pension to pension, or a millionaire whose money cannot spend 100 years. But his partner Nikki behaved quite differently. With an experienced eye, he immediately assessed patients depending on the thickness of their wallet. Machine marked for himself those who should be served in the first place. Nikki made it clear to the other patients that they would have to wait a long time for his help. That was until Emma Smith came into the surgery department. She looked about 60 years old, although no one could say more accurately, because the protracted disease has changed the person beyond recognition. For this reason, not everyone could determine the age of the patient. Emma arrived with the ambulance crew on a late July evening. No motorcade or personal security. According to her modest behavior, the medical staff of the ward immediately referred her to ordinary citizens, i.e., those who could not enter the paid wards. Emma herself behaved modestly, not showing her wealth in any way. Since the woman felt ill at home, she was brought to the ward in a house robe and slippers. Seeing her, Nicky grinned contemptuously and hurried to one of the wealthier patients, who had been feeding him tips for some time now. Steve, on the other hand, didn't hesitate and, approaching the patient, helped transport her to the room. After that, he sorted out the bed and brought fresh linens. All this the orderly did quickly and professionally, almost in the same breath. "Thank you. You're a very nice man," the patient mumbled and smiled. Steve nodded and asked her to talk less to keep up her energy. After thinking for a moment, he added, "You're welcome. I mean, it's my job, especially since I know how hard it is for sick people. I have a wheelchair-bound father myself." Emma looked at the young orderly with undisguised respect. At the time, no one realized that she was actually an influential businesswoman with a knack for understanding people like no one else. Once in the hospital, Emma decided to pretend to be an ordinary patient in order to evaluate the quality of treatment and understand how it was so different from the one for which you have to pay money. Frankly speaking, Emma knew very well that the disease was incurable. She had been told that a long time ago. In fact, given far less time than she had lived since the final diagnosis, Emma Smith had always considered herself a fighter, never gave up, fighting to the last, looking for new methods of treatment and prescribing scarce and sometimes even experimental drugs. Another in her place would have just dropped his hands and sadly lived out his last days. But she did not. She hoped that she could defeat her disease. All this turned out much later, when the influential businesswoman realized that if she continues to behave like this, then adequate treatment in this clinic, she simply will not wait. To begin with, she summoned the head of the department, who entered the room with a haughty look and looked at the patient with a challenge. "Did you want something?" he asked. "Yes, I did," she replied. "My name is Emma Smith. You may have heard of me. Several car dealerships in the city and a large hypermarket downtown. And that's not all of my business infrastructure." The head of the department turned pale. Aiden had always considered himself a prudent and prudent man. But how had he made such a mistake with this patient? Normally, he would make inquiries about patients beforehand so that he would know what to expect from them in the future. This one was a mistake. "What do you want, Emma?" the superintendent asked as gently as possible. What do I want? I want all patients to be treated in the same conditions. I understand your surprise, and I will add, I am ready to pay for it. That is, I want all the rooms in this ward to get rid of the prefix VIP and become equally good for everyone, regardless of their position. Is this possible? The head of the ward was breathless with surprise. Yes, it's possible, of course, but it will cost you a lot of money and take some time. Emma smiled. I don't have any time, so you'd better hurry up, sir. I'll send my manager to you and he'll take care of all the financial matters. I'll give you 24 hours to solve this problem. And if you can't do it in 24 hours, I'll call the ministry. And then I'll tell the head doctor that you're not in the position you should be in. Do you understand me? Or do you need to switch to French? Yes, of course, I understand, said the head of SAND. At that moment, he felt like a simple orderly who was being told off by the chief physician. Steve watched with attention and mentally thanked Emma that she was not afraid of the influential doctor of the clinic. But his partner Nicky realized too late the mistake of trying to find an approach to the influential patient. He constantly suffered one failure after another, and for this businesswoman had a very good reason. To Nicky's dismay, she remembered too well his reaction on the day of admission and was not going to forgive such an attitude not only to herself, but to all other patients in general. With Steve, Emma talked at length on various topics, feeling a strong sympathy for the nice, kind guy. Tell me, do you have a fiancé? Forgive me for my curiosity, but you are such a good man that it makes my heart ache. when you think that you might be alone. Steve looked away embarrassed. To tell the truth, he didn't feel comfortable talking about it. On the other hand, he didn't want to upset his patient and answered as he saw fit. Yes, there was a fiancée, Emma, but then we broke up. Vanessa's father runs a private clinic. He makes good money, and it's a big job. I'm just a regular orderly. When he found out his daughter met me, he drove a wedge between us. He found Vanessa fiancés in his own clinic. You know, someone with a lot of money. What about me? I don't even have my own car. I ride my bike to work. Emma smiled. So that's your wealth. It lies in your kindness, in your good attitude, and the fact that you don't have a car. You'll only be healthier. A bicycle, is a good thing. I used to ride it a lot when I was young. But now, as you can see, I'm sick. It's no use anymore, said the patient. Steve looked at her gratefully. She could cheer him up. Even though she was richer, he himself had never realized that wealthy people could be so kind to others. Thanks to Emma's funding, all the rooms in the ward were equipped with a TV and all the necessary amenities that had previously been available only in the VIP ward. Of course, it didn't happen all at once, but the bulk of it was done in the first few days. From then on, Steve and Emma became friends, as they both loved books and often exchanged opinions on what they had read, discussing favorite authors. The most interesting thing was that Steve had never once seen any of Emma's relatives come to visit. He'd seen the business manager in her room a couple of times, and a courier who brought some business papers right here, and no one else. Is she so lonely that there's no one to visit her at all? Puzzled the orderly. All Steve's attempts to inquire about it were to no avail, for at the mere hint of her family, Emma shut up and turned the conversation in another direction. One said that her children were long gone. Another said that she was a lonely widow and didn't know where to put her money. Rumors abounded. Each of the medical staff thought differently, trying to get to the truth. But the bottom line was that Emma was just a good and kind person who thought not only about herself, but also about others. She also had no patience for insolence and lies, which she had hated since childhood. A month ago, Emma passed away. It was Steve's day off that day. His father was sick again and needed help. Emma had a premonition of her passing and insisted on coming over to see her closer to lunch. Steve promised, but he couldn't keep his word. As luck would have it, Aiden had gotten so sick that he'd had to stay with his father until the evening. When he finally got to the station, he found out Emma was gone. How? I just saw her this morning during shift change, Steve whispered and clutched his head. Nikki shrugged indifferently. How's that? It was time, so she left. You knew about her illness. Yes, she understood everything, of course. Steve's eyes became moist, and tears made the boy's mind refuse to believe everything that had happened. No, it wasn't true. She couldn't leave. Just like that, without a word. Though what words could there be? For about a week after the funeral, Steve's conscience racked his soul. What had Emma wanted to tell him before she left? What had troubled her so much that she wanted to meet him in her final hour? Or maybe it was all just a coincidence. Well, there are such ordinary coincidences. He never got the answers to his questions, of course, and now the will. That Emma was a strange woman when she was alive, and when she died, she was a mystery. No, I'm not going to that cemetery. Let the money stay in the bank. She probably has some other relatives, distant or close. It doesn't matter. Here, let them take it, Steve thought. Steve whispered confidently. I don't want anyone else's. He stood up from the bench. The realization that he was right made him feel much stronger. Steve hurried home. He dismissed any thought of spending the night in the cemetery. No, he wasn't afraid of the dead. Not at all. But still, a cemetery was not the place to spend the night, not even for money. And a lot of money at that. But as soon as Steve opened the door of the house, he froze on the floor in an awkward pose. In the middle of the hallway lay his father. A little farther away stood an old wheelchair that appeared to have its wheels jammed again. What's wrong? Are you okay? Steve shouted and ran over. Aiden's breathing was practically audible. Steve touched his wrist out of fear and exhaled in relief. There was a pulse, albeit faint and indistinct, but there was still a pulse. Aiden's eyelashes fluttered. Then he slowly opened his eyes. "You scared me, Dad. What are you doing on the floor?" "Careful," Steve asked. His father wrinkled his nose and asked for help getting up. His son gently took him under his arms and slowly moved him into the wheelchair. "Here's the trouble. The wheel is stuck. Don't worry." The bearing went out again. So I lost my balance and fell to the floor. It's embarrassing, I'll tell you that. I fell on my back, so I couldn't roll over. I rolled over onto my stomach. I was exhausted, Aiden explained. At that moment, Steve felt another prick of conscience. He needed a new wheelchair. And the house should have been equipped with ramps a long time ago. But who needs it? That's right, no one but Steve and his father. Biting his lip painfully, he thought of Emma's will again. Should we go after all? But how long would it take? The house had been in need of repair for a long time. A wheelchair, again sanatorium resort treatment, clearly will not interfere. The man has only seen the sea in pictures. Even though he's a former trucker, and we have such health resorts in our country that they'll put anyone on his feet. Of course, Aiden had no idea what his son was thinking at that moment, and Steve was already in the cemetery, the same one where Emma was buried in one of the alleys. Why did she have to think of all this? But what could happen at night in a city cemetery? Looking longingly at his father's hunched figure, Steve found himself thinking that he would fulfill his patient's last wish. If that's what she wanted, let her have it at least in the other world. And how else, when this world is no longer bright? Deciding not to tell his family about it, Steve began to prepare for a night out to the cemetery. He charged a couple of flashlights with replaceable. The caretaker took a couple of steps in the direction of the visitor and thought. He could not forbid him to come to the cemetery. It was not in his power, but it would be dark in an hour or two, and it would be a very ungrateful thing to walk through a cemetery in pitch darkness. Well, if it's so decided, I won't oppose it. I believe he's a good man. I'm sure you won't do anything stupid. I'm not mistaken, am I? The caretaker asked in a quiet, pleasant voice. Steve smiled embarrassedly. No, you're not wrong. It's just the way it's going to be. I'm sorry. I don't know your first name or middle name. Dave, come in when you get back. I'll buy you a cup of tea, and if necessary, I'll call you a cab, the caretaker said, again quietly switching to you. Steve nodded and waved goodbye. The orderly's soul felt noticeably warmer. He would not be alone in the cemetery tonight after all. Of course, it wasn't much consolation, but it wasn't so bad. After about 10 minutes, Steve reached the right place. The grave mound looked quite fresh, as if it had been erected only yesterday, not a month ago. Due to the short time of burial, the monument had not yet been erected, and instead there was a large iron cross with a picture of the deceased. As he approached the grave, Steve bowed his head mournfully. I'm sorry, Emma, I let you down. I said I'd talk to you, but I didn't show up. I'm sorry if you can, he whispered, looking at the photograph. Steve caught himself thinking that the admirer's lips were touched by a smile, slightly visible, but no less touching. That's how Steve remembered Emma, with whose appearance the surgery department was literally transformed before his eyes. And she knew she was terminally ill. And why did she go to a regular clinic? She could have gone to a private organization where care and service were much better. It was a mystery. Steve sat down on the bench next to the grave and thought, why did she organize all this? Was it to make him confess? Unlikely she wasn't a petty person, not at all. Then what was the clue? Where's the solution to this puzzle? 100 questions couldn't be answered quietly. It wasn't like that at all. And why did it have to be at night anyway? Why not during the day? Not in the morning, not in the evening after all. There were so many questions that with all his desire he could not find answers to them. Meanwhile, dusk was slowly settling over the cemetery. Steve's heart beat uneasily. Despite the fact that the orderly was a materialist, the cemetery at night frightened him very much. A slightly noticeable shiver ran through the boy's body as he reached into his bag to pull out a flashlight. At that moment, Steve involuntarily shifted his gaze to the massive iron cross placed on Emma's grave. He didn't notice anything special at first, but then, looking closer, he almost jumped up on the bench in surprise. The cross glowed with a green, slightly visible light. Steve involuntarily made the sign of the cross and shook like an aspen leaf. This was it. Here we go. Or had he gone mad with fear? Or was something strange really going on in the cemetery? Steve froze on the bench with a deadening grip. A minute passed, then another, but nothing terrible was happening. On the contrary, somewhere in the bushes there was the crackling of crickets, which are known to sense danger and usually shut up if there is any. Steve took a closer look at the cross and, to his amazement, realized that the mysterious glow was emitted not by it, but by a strange substance, with which the construction had obviously been lubricated beforehand. The boy jumped up from the bench and walked around the grave, stopping at the back of the cross. Steve's assumptions were immediately confirmed. On the backside was a greenish arrow pointing to its base. Steve gingerly touched the arrow with his fingers, and in the same minute they turned a greenish color. Why, it's phosphorus, he thought. Is that why Emma recommended in her will that I come at night? Otherwise I wouldn't have seen the clue. But where is that arrow pointing? Steve exclaimed, forgetting that he was in the middle of a city cemetery. Then, coming to his senses, he pressed his hand fearfully to his lips and mentally apologized to the inhabitants of the realm of the dead. Since the point of the arrow was aimed at the base of the cross, the guy knelt down and began to rake the ground in that place. In a couple of minutes, Steve dug out a small container, wrapped in transparent cellophane for greater safety. Oh boy, and Emma had come up with such a clever combination that it made my head spin. I can't believe she'd think of something like that. From the shock and excitement, Steve's body was shaking and sweat was beading on his forehead. Now that the orderly had found the dead woman's hiding place, he no longer saw the point in sitting in the cemetery in pitch darkness and could go home. I wonder what's in that container. Money, gold, securities, Steve thought on the way back. The keeper's lodge, which from afar looked like a lighthouse for stranded sailors, served as a landmark for him. Steve felt much better. It was an adventure to spend the night in the middle of a cemetery. Even a skeptic would believe in the existence of otherworldly forces, especially when there is a full moon shining overhead and not a single living soul around. But no sooner had Steve reached the gatehouse than he saw that something strange was going on inside. In the brightly lighted windows, the profile of the keeper was visible in minute detail. There's lanky figure rose from his chair and, staggering from side to side, took a couple of steps in the direction of the exit. What? Is he drunk or something? It doesn't look like it, though. He sounds like a decent guy. You can tell, Steve thought ironically. He had already moved a good dozen meters away from the gatehouse when he heard a slightly audible voice behind him. Help, help, I'm suffocating. Steve turned around and saw that the door of the gatehouse had swung open and Joe was standing in the doorway, holding onto the door jamb with one hand and his throat with the other, wheezing like a wounded animal. The caretaker clutched his chest with both hands and collapsed onto the asphalt warmed by the day's sun. Steve didn't hesitate a second. He ran over and rolled the old man onto his back. Joe was clearly choking, and the cause was probably swelling of the larynx. It was very enlarged. But what caused the swelling? Allergies, a congenital disease. There was no time to think. Time was running out in minutes. Steve's first thought was to call an ambulance, but then, looking at the blue face of the caretaker, he realized he couldn't wait any longer. He was still a little shaken from the stress he'd been through. His throat felt as dry as if someone had poured sand down it. Needless to say, the ambulance paramedic was surprised to see that Steve had definitely saved the caretaker's life with his actions. Where'd you learn to do that, kid? That incision was masterful. You're not a surgeon, are you? Your face looks familiar to me, the paramedic asked. Steve shook his head negatively, then answered, No, I never went to medical school. I'm an orderly in the surgery department. I've seen it done a couple of times, so I had to put it into practice. The paramedic patted the boy respectfully on the shoulder. You did the right thing, didn't you? His grandfather was allergic to wasp venom. He decided to eat honey in his retirement. Those striped ones got him. If it hadn't been for you, the poor guy would have died of asphyxiation. He'd be dead now. Steve just waved his hand. You're welcome. It's the same thing we do as health workers, no matter how you look at it. But no sooner had he moved a couple of meters away from the old woman than the doctor called him again. Hey kid, I'm thinking. How did you get here in the first place? Maybe you need a ride to the city. You'll be with us all the way to work. Why beat your legs? Steve turned around. I came to see someone I know tonight. I didn't realize it was dark. I wouldn't mind a ride into town. Well, that's just great. It's a sin to refuse, so I'm all for it. And in 5 minutes, Steve was in the ambulance with the paramedic and Joe lying on the gurney. The guy's mood had improved considerably. In the bag there was a container, found thanks to the clue with phosphorus on the cross. But Steve decided to open it at home, deciding not to go to the ward, so as not to annoy Nikki with his appearance. Steve got off at the gate of the hospital yard and, zipping up his jacket, walked towards home. By this time his father was already asleep, and when he heard the sound of the door opening, he mumbled softly and covered his head with a blanket. The nights in August were cool enough, after all. Steve knew that as well as anyone, so he decided not to wake his father with the noise of the shower. The boy washed himself under the faucet, washing his head to cool his mind and put his thoughts in order. After that, he locked himself in his room, where he placed the container he had found in the cemetery on the table. To Steve's surprise, inside was a folded piece of paper and a small silver pendant on a chain. Turning the item toward the light, Steve noticed a slightly visible engraving on the back of it. It contained only one word: forever. That's odd. Usually they put different phrases, quotes, but at the very least names. But here it's just one word, Steve thought, and put the pendant away in his desk drawer. Then unfolded the sheet. From the first words he realized that the message was addressed to him, and it began with the following words. Dear Steve, if you are reading these lines now, it means that I am no longer alive. I'm sorry for that scene in the cemetery, where I forced you to spend some time in pitch darkness. I hope you got it right and left the place immediately as you found my hiding place. You're probably thinking, crazy grandmother, she's playing charades, but I just turned 45. You see how illness changes people? Yesterday I was beautiful, and today I'm Baba Yaga. It so happens that in this life I couldn't trust anyone but you. Many years ago I made a serious mistake, but more about that later. Since I have no direct heirs, all my assets must go to my third cousins who are just waiting for me to die. Their people are already everywhere. In my business, my house, my immediate neighborhood. I cannot even trust a notary, because I am not sure of his honesty. For this reason, I leave myself an impressive amount of money in the bank. Dispose of it properly. Now let's get to the point. 20 years ago, I committed a crime. No, I didn't kill anyone. I killed myself when I gave my newborn daughter to an orphanage in a fit of depression. Don't judge me harshly. I know I was a naive fool who ran away from the provinces after a traveling construction worker. I got pregnant and he left me and turned out to be the father of 4 children. But I still remember his gift, a locket with the inscription forever. The second one he had on the day he broke up. I took it from my failed fiancé. You might even consider it stolen. I don't care. A 45-year-old woman facing her death doesn't lie, does she? The inscription on his locket said together, "You're a smart boy. You'll know right away." Those who put the 2 lockets together will receive the phrase "together forever." Now for the most important part. I put my runaway boyfriend's locket in the bottom of the basket with my daughter. I never saw my baby girl again. I later married a criminal mastermind and inherited his assets, growing them into an empire, and I became queen without a moment's hesitation, except I couldn't find my daughter. Illness is my punishment, my karma, if you prefer. God sees everything and punishes those who do terrible things. And now my hour of reckoning has come. Save the letter. Steve, find my daughter. I don't spare any money. There's enough in there to last the rest of your life. Protect my daughter, no matter what it takes. You're young. You can do it. I'm leaving. Don't judge. Try to understand your mother. Sincerely, Emma Smith. Rereading this message over and over, Steve couldn't hold back the tears. God, what a cruel punishment. To be all alone on my deathbed, and no one to serve a glass of water. Though they will, of course, but for money the tears flowed down Steve's cheeks with utter indifference as he pictured the scenes of Emma's hard life, which had been a trying one. That night he could not sleep. He tossed and turned in bed until morning. Then he got up, washed his face, and brewed a cup of strong coffee. Son, did you change your mind about working yesterday? Didn't you run to your fiancée? Dad asked. Steve smiled. No, what brides are there? I've had so much to do that my head is spinning. Aiden shook his head. What a good son I've got, though. A sight to behold. A real groom for marriage. Dad, we're going to buy you a new stroller the other day. You know what? We're going to get you a new stroller, Steve said. You know, the one you've been dreaming of with the power wheelchair, Steve announced. What do you mean? A stroller? Well, it costs money, and there's something else to put together. And you can buy a used car, and the old stroller will survive. Just buy me a bearing. Unless you come up and take Berkutu off, it'll come in handy, said Aiden. But Steve only grinned. No, Dad will buy a stroller. That's right. Where'd we get that kind of money? You're not involved in crime, are you? Aiden raised an eyebrow in surprise. Steve came over to his father and put his arm around his shoulders. No, there's no crime. Don't worry about the money. It'll all change soon. Aiden nodded and furtively brushed away a tear. In the meantime, Steve got ready and hurried to work. He slipped the locket into his pocket and closed the door behind him. Emma's confession had touched him to the core. All the way to the hospital building, Steve could think of nothing but the story of the missing businesswoman. Who was she? Was she alive now? Or maybe long since married? But as soon as Steve crossed the threshold of the surgical ward, Nikki immediately rushed towards him. What kind of people don't have guards? Oh, come on, Steve. Where'd you find that, Uncle? You got 3 of them in there, and you got him so good at it. What are you, a surgeon or something? The whole clinic's on fire. Steve Smith operated on his grandfather's share of the cemetery. That's a great plot for a thriller, don't you think? Steve waved it off. Oh, come on. Nothing much happened there. But that's the way it is. The main thing is that you got help in time, and I don't need a better thank you. Nikki surprised. Wow, you surprised me, Steve. You surprised me. It's the granddaughter of the old man came to check on him, along with his great-grandchildren, by the way. Just imagine triplets, 3 or 4 years old. She's a good-looking chick. I wouldn't mind playing romance with her, but my back hurts too much. I can't carry 3. Steve smiled. Nikki always had one thing on her mind. What an adventurer. Deciding to visit the cemetery caretaker on occasion, Steve changed into his uniform and cautiously opened the door of the room. From what the attendant saw before him, a cute smile played across his face. Around Joe's bed were a group of great-grandchildren, and sitting on a chair nearby was a pretty woman, about 25 or so. Seeing his savior, Grandpa waved his arms, though he couldn't say anything because of the cut. And you must be Steve. The paramedic told us all about it. Anyway, if it hadn't been for you, things could have ended much worse. My name is Emma, by the way. Emma Smith, Joe's granddaughter, said, and held out her tiny hand to the paramedic. It's a pleasure. You're welcome. It's my job, the guy smiled. At that moment, the door of the room opened, and the profile of an unshaven man with a distinctive wedge cap on his round head cut short. His shirt was wrinkled, his pants as worn as ever with oil stains around the knees, and his dirty shoes looked as if they had been walked across the Sahara Desert. Steve wrinkled his nose in displeasure and remarked in a low voice, "You can't go in here without booties." What booties? Be thankful that I even came to this, and almost gave my soul to God at the workplace. You should be buried at the cash register, the stranger muttered, casting an angry glance in Emma's direction. Is it really the husband? Steve's mind flashed. No singing? All right. That's what you came for. And drunk, too. Couldn't have done it without you, the woman blurted out. He, who was called Pete, grinned viciously, displaying a slender row of iron teeth. You'll manage. You can't take a step without me. That was your 6th son. Now, old man, what am I? A walking ATM machine. Steve clenched his fists painfully, mentally praying to the heavens that this unpleasant man would shut up before he got a punch in the eye. But Pete wasn't going to calm down. Instead, he walked over to Emma and tried to grab her shoulder. causing the fabric to rattle alarmingly. "Pete, what are you doing?" "Let go. You're hurting me," she pleaded. Pete grinned viciously and was about to make a move, but Steve twisted. Claire looked apprehensively at the class she was about to be the new girl in. Her father had gotten a high appointment in this town. Like they weren't doing well in New York. No, he needed a springboard to advance his career. His old position had become too tight for his ambitions. Now they'd have to spend about 5 years here. Her arrival did not arouse much interest in her classmates. Well, a new girl came. That's fine. Everyone was talking animatedly about the summer vacation that had just ended. There were some remarks to her. "Mom sent me to the country. I was stuck in the vegetable garden, picking all the crops. It's good that there is a lake in the village. We went fishing every other day. Then we fried fish on the shore on the coals from the fire. Girls, look what a sundress I got at the sea. Girls." All the boys looked at me. I was so pretty. Near the window, 2 slightly funny bespectacled men, a girl and a guy, were talking to each other about the list of additional literature for extracurricular reading. "No, I never got into this Shakespeare and his Hamlet," said the guy. "But Remarque's Three Comrades is a thing. I reread it twice." "And I took up the Master and Margarita ahead of time," replied the girl. I couldn't tear myself away. I swallowed it. "You haven't read it yet? I'll bring you the novel tomorrow. It's definitely your type." Claire remembered similar conversations after long vacations at school in Moscow. Heaven and earth, a completely different world and life. How could she share with her new classmates that she'd sunbathed on France's Côte d'Azur this summer and then traveled with her parents to the Greek island of Crete, exploring the traces of civilization? They would have gawked at her as if she were an alien. But there was no choice. One had to get used to it and settle in. And she wasn't proud or imagining she'd been born with a silver spoon in her mouth. Hannah had managed to catch her parents' life and her own in a communal apartment with 4 families in the neighborhood. Then her father dramatically moved up the career ladder. A designer by trade, he invented something for the airplane industry. Hannah was never interested in the details. Nevertheless, he had first been invited to work in New York City from the suburbs, and now he was sent to head a new industrial plant in the Northwest, built specifically for his brilliant, undoubtedly talented invention. Hannah's mother didn't come from a wealthy family. She started out as a manicure and pedicure master in New York City. Her husband, with fabulous fees for new technical ideas, helped her buy out a rundown hair salon. In a year, a woman with golden hands turned the institution into an elite salon. She followed her husband like a Decembrist wife. Is it possible that women don't go for manicures and pedicures? Will she be in demand in the new place? In a medium-sized town, the family of a designer, and now the head of a large company. 3-room apartments in a new building were allocated to them immediately. You can't miss such a specialist. Who could replace him? He is constantly generating new inventions. In an apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, they were looking for a beauty parlor manager. Hannah's mother came in handy from the get-go. What was Hannah supposed to do? She couldn't live a sheltered life. Now it was a 3-stop bus ride to school. It's a short distance. In good weather, you could easily walk it. That's how she ended up in 10th grade. It was still 2 years until she received her matriculation certificate. When the bell finally rang on September 1st, the class teacher introduced the newcomer to the class and looked around. "We don't have a lot of desks in the classroom. You, Hannah, have only 1 seat next to our local star Robin Kovalev. Here he is, late as usual." The table was the last one in the middle row. Claire looked back at her newly arrived classmate. Tall, statuesque, handsome, with mischievous eyes. He was wearing jeans and a blue polo shirt that fit him well. You could sit at the same desk with a guy like that, since there were no other options. He and Robin were silent for the first 2 classes, and then they talked about everything. The guy wasn't as well read as she was, didn't watch some movies, and didn't read many books, except for internet videos. He had never traveled further than Miami and had only seen this sea, had not been to New York, Washington. About Europe and other continents, where Claire had already been, she immediately kept silent. But he could definitely give her a head start on domestic matters. He fixed Claire's broken backpack in seconds. And when the homeroom teacher was handing out tickets to the touring production of Michael Rochon's Valentine, and Valentine Robin had gotten them the 2 best seats. It was a gift from their parents to all the students in honor of the start of the school year. Getting into their drama theater during the arrival of the capital's artists wasn't easy. So Claire and Robin became fast friends that no one noticed how the formidable Robin Kovalev fell in love with the new girl at first sight. It was written all over his face. Claire accepted his attentions condescendingly. After the play, she let him walk her out, but she wouldn't let him kiss her in the entryway yet. She was a girl with old-fashioned views and principles, wouldn't kiss a guy after 3 days of dating. On the way, she told Robin about famous actors and the meaning of Rochon's play, but he never understood the meaning of the title. He remained silent. He didn't want to seem like a silly man, far from the theater arts. What bothered him was a meeting he'd set up with some guys from the neighborhood about some, as they put it, proposal of interest to him. He and Claire were from different families. He'd never had any extra money at home. His parents, tobacco factory workers, breathed tobacco dust all day and sold the surplus off the line to the neighbors. Robin had an older brother who was already married. They all lived in an old private house with green shutters on the windows and a wooden porch that creaked under the footsteps of adults. Robin's parents already had 2 grandchildren running around in the yard, and everyone had to be clothed and fed. So the guy had long ago adapted to part-time work, selling surplus cigarettes to passers-by or unloading trucks near the grocery store on weekends. So he bought his jeans, in which he flaunted in front of his classmates, and a fashionable polo shirt himself. And now he was feverishly thinking about what kind of lucrative offer the older guys from the neighboring neighborhood had decided to make him. They looked a little criminal. Yeah, well, he's not the shy type either. He'll figure it out. If he can make some money, he'll take Claire to the movies, back row. Maybe she'll finally let him kiss her. That dream made him shiver with desire. Claire didn't feel the same way. The timid advances of the first guy in the new place had only boosted her self-esteem. But she was a little bored with him. Where was she, and where was he? It's ridiculous to think of them as a couple. She even told her mom that she had a devoted beau. But she'd said, "You should be thinking about your studies, Claire. With your looks and my ability to emphasize them, you will always be worthy of many." Claire smiled contentedly. The burning interest from a cute boy is still nice to me. Mommy, we'll see there. What's the best thing to use him for? At this moment, the cute guy was just approaching the meeting place with potential employers in the vacant lot. There was no fear. At stake was a date with Claire, for whom he was ready to get the moon out of the sky. There was one female among the silent crowd that soon surrounded him. Even though he loved his high school sweetheart, Robin was a little taken aback. At first, she was beautiful. Her loose hair swept down her formidable back in a wave of red, and her green eyes looked boldly at the dashing crowd of young men, not at all embarrassed by their formidable appearance. She was built like Aphrodite, brave like the warlike Athena, and made for love like the beautiful Venus. Robin wasn't very familiar with Greek and Roman mythology, but that was the image the young woman conjured up. Pushing this beautiful vision aside, a large guy with angry wolf eyes, the leader of the group with a huge ego, stepped forward. "So that's what you are, the local Caliban. I've heard rumors of your technical talents. Rumor has it you can pick any lock with 2 pops. Are people lying or stories?" Robin did indeed help everyone in the neighborhood all the time. People would lose their keys to their apartment or garage, or something would get stuck or break, leaving the owners unable to use the mechanism. He'd come over, click a couple times, and everything would work like clockwork. or at least it would open, allowing eager neighbors to enter. "It's not much of a science," the big guy said. "My father worked all his life as an adjuster on the line and taught his sons a few things along the way. People do not lie. I'm friends with locks of almost any complexity. What do you want?" "Don't push your luck," Kid, the leader of the local gang, cut him off. "We have a proposition for you, a favorable one for all of us. I won't keep you waiting in riddles. All genius is simple. You'll open the cars for us, the ones we tell you to open. We'll pay you handsomely for your talents. Think about it for 3 days. We await your decision." Robin looked at the leader in silence, at the members of the group, at the smiling girl. He didn't think much about it, so he answered right away. "Why wait 3 days? I'm in." Everyone around him breathed a sigh of relief. The leader of the street group extended his hand, and then also patted him approvingly on the shoulder, saying, "And the man, as Vysotsky has it, a proven comrade of ours." Robin opened the first car the next day. The rest was not his concern. He'd gotten his share of the money that very evening. Now he had the means to invite Claire not only to a movie, but also to a cafe beforehand. The carousel spun, the money flowed. The guy didn't think about the consequences. Fate was keeping him safe for now. Robin and Claire went not only to a fancy restaurant, to a concert of a rock band in a closed club, to an exhibition of impressionist painters where they couldn't understand a single picture, but also went to a country entertainment center with kebabs and a heated pool in the fresh air. Things weren't moving. Claire wouldn't let the guy anywhere near her body or her soul. He didn't know how to make her reciprocate his feelings, and agonized with this uncertainty all the time. He wanted to ask her directly, "Are we together, or are you just playing with me?" One day, once again, he tried to press her against the wall in the entryway. They pressed their lips together, but she pushed him away. "Robin." She called him often when they were alone together. "Who the hell do you think you are? That's not why we're friends anymore. We're from parallel worlds in culture, development, intelligence. Do you remember the play Valentine and Valentina? It was about couples like you and me. Be thankful I'm still spending time with you, but don't ever let go." That hat doesn't fit Robin at all. He left, slamming the front door loudly, and he was gone for a long time. At school, he moved abruptly to another desk, putting the right bespectacled boy next to Claire. After school, he didn't see her off, didn't ask her to go for a walk, didn't put chocolates or apples in her backpack. New Year's Eve passed. Winter vacation flashed by. To Claire and her mother did not get bored. Her father took them to the hot Miami to bask in the sun. In January, the girl returned rested and tanned, and there ran the days of the longest quarter. There was no time to think. She didn't even look at Robin. They were friends. They stopped being friends. It happens when you're young. And Robin had gone off to experiment with car theft. He didn't get disturbed very often, once a week or even twice a week. It usually took him no more than a couple of minutes to work with the lock, and often with the alarm system. The car had no time to make a pitiful squeak, and already changed the owner. And everything would have gone on smoothly, but once again, at the resale gang of hijackers punctured. The owner of the car was a certain influential official. The criminals were caught quickly, and did not treat them with ceremony for a long time. The longest sentence was given to Mickey, but the others were to spend more than a year in prison. None of the boys mentioned Robin. They kept their mouths shut. He got off scot-free. Good thing the kid was in the habit of saving up his stash. He changed his clothes, kissed his family, gave presents, and laid low. Senior year's coming up. He wasn't getting good grades, and after school he had to go somewhere to study. He could use a little capital. Robin tried to tear Claire out of his soul, but she stayed there like a splinter. Sometimes he said to himself, "Well, I'm not Valentine. She's not my Valentine. It's not fate. He met the girlfriend of the leader of their street team at the store by chance. She had faded. She was buying cigarettes for herself in front of his eyes, not the most expensive ones. What did she have enough money for? Slid a casual glance at him. Hannah didn't recognize him at first, but then she perked up. "Are you out, Robin? Skipping school? Why don't you buy the lady some champagne? I'm starting to forget what champagne tastes like." "Easy," Robin said in her tone of voice. "Pick whichever one's looking at you in the window." Hannah, a sultry redhead, chose a local red sparkling wine that tasted good. She bought a box of assorted cakes, a slice of cheese, and a bag of mixed nuts. Taking Robin under her arm, she whispered languidly in his ear, "Come to my place. I'm home alone now. Ricardo is dying of boredom and boredom. Already what has come to what soap operas on TV began to watch, when in his stall behind the counter is not standing behind the counter. The owner is such a jerk, he hasn't paid my salary for 2 weeks. He says it's a small turnover. What am I supposed to eat, pray tell?" Robin's legs were starting to feel wobbly. This mature, experienced girl had him worried sick. At 16, who wouldn't want to have a peek at a woman like that? He quickly mumbled, "I'll be right back," and went back to the store. He'd have to get the redhead something special. But what would he find in a regular supermarket? The idea came quickly he'd spoil her a little. He stuffed a bag full of tropical fruit, a carton of the most expensive cigarettes, a bottle of Armenian cognac. Robin rushed outside, hoping that his vision in female form hadn't evaporated. Hannah waited for him patiently. She must have been desperate for money. She looked greedily into his bag, approved. "You're a good-looking boy, and looks quite nice, and you are a friend of the head. Come here. We're announcing an after-hours party tonight. Call your parents and tell them you're staying at a friend's house. I like to take long walks, take my time." Robin's feet hit the ground when she said that. He had texted something on the phone to his parents that he would be unloading cars all night and then spending the night at a buddy's place near the mall. His parents haven't controlled his personal life in a long time. He goes to school, doesn't skip class. That's good enough. Moreover, it's a day off Sunday. No need to go to school tomorrow. Let the boy have fun as he wants. It's a young thing, fun. No need for money. And they don't have a penny to spare. Hannah didn't live in the palace Robin had imagined. It was an old, shabby, 2-story house. It had clearly been built a long time ago. The entryway smelled, as usual, of sauerkraut and a little bit of cats and mice. A couple of stray cats were just warming themselves near the radiator on a thin cardboard. "I'm so sick of you two," Hannah kicked one of them angrily. In another time, Robin would have stood up for these stray animals, but now he remained fearfully silent. This woman was leading him into an unknown world. He was afraid of spoiling the romance of the imminent moment. As promised, Hannah's celebration of their meeting was very leisurely. She asked him to open both champagne and cognac, but she mixed them together in tall, thin glasses, squeezed juice from large oranges, cut up fruit, enjoyed nuts and elite cheese. Then she suddenly announced to Robin that she was hot and had to change right in her room, and she didn't think to leave for the bathroom. The experienced Amazon and the young tough guy made a great duo. The rest of the winter flashed by. In an instant, Robin was running to his goddess like a faithful knight, henchman, servant. The stash had long since been retrieved from its hiding place. Hannah's appetite had grown by leaps and bounds. His supplies were no longer enough for new boots or pearl earrings. It was a strange affair, no matter how you looked at it. Robin was ready to become her slave. Every time he was with her, it was as if he were dying and being reborn from the thrill of sensuality. He was jealous of Mickey, who was now in jail, painting pictures of her with him. Thoughts of Claire vanished from Robin's mind almost without a trace. So she sometimes briefly resurfaced in Robin's mind, along with the urge to say, "You should see what a gorgeous woman I have in my arms right now. You're no match for me," and you kept calling me Mister. Poor man, smoking all the time. We're not a couple. Claire went to school pensive. At home, her father's company wasn't good. Somewhere up there was a change of leadership. Directives came one after the other, and they were all kind of silly, like commands: stop there, come here. These constant swings were undermining the company from the inside. Claire's father kept saying he was going to quit the whole thing. He wasn't a boy to be bullied like that. The women in the family had thought he was joking at first, relieving the tension by yelling at them both. But his character was deteriorating before their eyes. In the clinic, where the woman, frightened by such actions, went, the psychotherapist nodded understandingly. This is a midlife crisis, which fell for a man at a difficult time in his professional life. If you want to save him from an early stroke or heart attack, it is better to let him uncompromisingly quit than to suffer another humiliation from his bosses. That same evening, a major family conversation took place in their home. Claire's mother even took time off work for the occasion and prepared a special dinner. She didn't keep the problem from her daughter. She also told her husband directly what awaited him if he stayed at his old job. We all made a decision together with drawings and ideas. Out. A bright design head like that can be useful anywhere. Claire's father at first refused, all translated arrows on the fact that they will lose a lot in material terms. But his wife was a stubborn woman, and she loved her husband dearly. We need you alive and well, and we'll earn the rest with a stranger. We'll do it. Haven't we afforded ourselves enough? Eating good food, dressing nicely, spending money freely on trips. You and me, honey, we've seen a lot of things. Lucinda's got a lot more ahead of her. It's time to make a stop. Tomorrow you'll be handing in your letter of resignation. The woman wasn't wrong in the slightest. Such an experienced designer was immediately poached by a nice technical research institute. Claire's father no longer believed the promising promises of his former colleagues that all roads were open to him. Fish rots from the head. The industry's leadership was clearly going the wrong way. The wrong way it was only a matter of time. The girl's mother continued to work in her beauty parlor. Claire was safely into the 11th grade. Life did not stop, only the demands and opportunities became different. The key was that the family came out of the alleged circumstances without moral and physical losses. This is a good time to remember the famous wisdom: God, thank you for taking money. 11th grade. No bright moves in the lives of two. Well, he can't sleep properly in my house. Especially my parents went to a sanatorium for a month and should have returned only by the beginning of my exams, she thought. Outside the window she smelled lilacs, cherry blossoms, and spring May. Now she would make herself some coffee and sandwiches and go cram for English. Tomorrow was class, and she hadn't even started her notes yet. Robin slept through the day and the night. When he woke up, he didn't even realize where he was. In the kitchen, someone was humming a popular song. It smelled of coffee and fresh baked goods. He instinctively moved toward the tantalizing sounds and smells. In the cozy kitchen with light curtains on the windows was Claire. She was baking pancakes and humming something to herself. "Claire, did I sleep here for almost 24 hours?" he asked. "You're welcome," she said. "I'm alone now. My parents are at sea, while still affordable rates in the sanatorium, and I was left on the farm. Is breakfast ready? Go wash up now." And so Robin became her housemate. The loud bells were ringing in her ears. It was as if this hard time with Hannah and the warm tea and heart-wrenching connection hadn't happened. The sun was shining through the window, bright and almost summer warm. Not a cloud in the sky. The sense of spring blossoms floated through the room. A stack of ruddy pancakes on a plate beckoned with appetite, and next to it a saucer with sour cream, coffee in clay mugs, a jar of condensed milk, a plastic package with jam. He had forgotten that mornings could be so serene and bright. He touched his lips lightly to Claire's before leaving gratefully. She smelled deliciously of pancakes and new blackcurrant jam. For the first time, she didn't pull away. As he said goodbye, he suddenly thought, she's all grown up now, or I'm no longer disgusting, unnecessary, inappropriate for her. He walked to Hannah's house with a heavy heart, urged on by her. The required amount of money he had never been able to earn. Opening the door with the key the woman had given him, he listened for a long time. There was silence in the apartment. Only in the room there were sounds like whispers. He opened the door. On the table was a box with the most expensive phone that his girlfriend had dreamed of. There were two people lying on the bed, talking quietly. Get out. Hannah threw him in his direction without even batting an eyebrow. I waited for you yesterday, my boy, and it's late today. The train left, taking the other passengers with it. Finita la comedy. Put the key to my apartment on the nightstand in the hallway and forget about it. I'm sick of you. Robin left her house without a sound. He felt as if he'd been doused with dirty water by an unscrupulous landlady somewhere in the back of his life. He listened to himself in surprise. He no longer wanted that red-haired, so artificial love, for which he would easily have laid the whole world at her feet if he had had the chance. Nor did he think of Claire. Last night in her apartment now seemed to him a dream, a joke, a mirage, an illusion. He had thrown all his energies into getting away from this shameful city. He would join the army, enlist in the north, become a long-distance sailor, a polar explorer, a submariner, only not to see more of these streets, which brought him nothing but hardship and betrayal. Claire and Robin passed their high school graduation exams without a hitch. She got the prestigious A's and he got the C's. That didn't stop them from getting their diplomas after the day they'd unexpectedly spent together at Claire's apartment. The young people talked sweetly sometimes, but it never got any further than that. It was as if a glass partition stood between them. They could see each other, but they couldn't get closer, despite the fragility of the imaginary barrier. A month later, Claire started packing her bags for the regional center. She was determined to follow her dream of conquering the skies in a beautiful stewardess uniform. Robin left all the extra nighttime loading jobs behind. Since he was a little older than his classmates, the military draft was just around the corner for him. The girl passed the entrance exams to the institute that trains specialists in civil aviation without difficulty. She put her things in the dormitory, decided to return to her parents for a week, while she has not yet so easily experienced the separation from them. At the train station, unexpectedly met a school friend who saw his family off on vacation. "Claire, what are you doing in town?" he asked. "I heard that you successfully entered the university. You're going to be the pride of our class, a sky wizard on airliners." "You know, Robin, I didn't expect to be such a daddy's girl," she said. "It's only been a couple weeks without them. I miss them. I came here to spend a little more time with them. What are you going to do tonight?" Suddenly, her ex-boyfriend asked her, "You haven't thought about it yet. Is there a proposal?" "Why not?" Robin said with an air of importance. "Let's go to the movie theater and spend some time. I don't have the money, but I can afford to buy a ticket for my friend." They had both grown up. Robin didn't want to puff up his cheeks to show that he was such an important guy. As they say, love us poor, love us rich, everyone will love us. Claire herself had changed. She no longer cared about her comrade's status as before. She was more attracted by the fact that she was always very easy with him. They agreed to meet in the park by the movie theater that evening. Robin didn't take the last row of tickets, so that he could be with his girlfriend in the dark seclusion, who had Hannah helped him get close to. He had no desire to kiss Claire, much less to take her to bed. There was a huge distance between the two women, and he sensed it keenly. After a rather interesting movie, they walked home. Robin told his former classmate about his plans to serve in the army and then to get an education. Claire told him the story of her vacation in Crete with her parents. There they once rented a car to see the capital of the island. They were driving along a quiet highway when suddenly, almost next to them, a passenger airliner with burning portholes soared into the sky. Apparently, the local airport was a stone's throw from the road. This stunning sight was the impetus for her future dream. She had already imagined herself walking with a tray of drinks between the rows of seats. Now she was taking real steps towards realizing it. In Claire's entryway, there was an unexpected event for Robin. The girl stood on tiptoe and kissed him herself. "Thank you," she said. "I've been working on my textbooks all last year. Already forgot what it is to go to the movies, carefree to spend the evening in pleasant company." He didn't pounce on her like a kite, but returned her tender kiss, put his arm around her shoulders, pressed her against him for a split second, and then released her. "Claire, marry me," Robin said. "You're always so sweet. It's not for nothing that I used to swoon when you touched my hand at school. You've stirred up all those feelings in me today. I've changed my views on many things in life. I promise to wait for your answer as long as it takes." Claire was stunned. "Robin, you are crazy. And you're still crazy," she began to make her arguments confusingly. "What marriage? I don't turn 18 until October. Ahead of years of study, formation, career in the chosen profession. I have long ago thrown out of my head all silly ideas about princes and princesses. Now I want something else to stand firmly on my feet in life. And there and then think about a husband." He was not offended by her refusal. The main thing here was to indicate his intentions. Perhaps the girl was right. He hurried, voiced them on a wave of emotional impulse. The truth was that he spoke sincerely. He really felt surprisingly good and at ease with her. "I heard you," he said calmly to the girl. "I will not give up my dream of marrying you. I will pursue you again and again. And someday you will realize that I am like in that popular song, The One Who Is Needed." They had ice cream at the cafe. "Tomorrow we'll go for a chocolate-covered ice cream with sprinkles and nuts. We'll have it tomorrow. I've got a stash," Robin suggested. During the week, they had time to eat ice cream and go to the movies a couple of times. They said goodbye in the entryway, as was the custom. A couple of tender kisses as a sign of warmth in their relationship, and then they went home. Robin didn't recognize himself. He was afraid of offending Claire with his overly insistent, frank touches and pushing. He wanted to get to know this girl gradually, in small sips, and someday to know her completely. 7 days later, Claire left to study, and he stayed behind to wait for the summons to the military enlistment office. He didn't get high marks on his school certificate. He hoped with all his might that he would make up for it by serving in the army, where institutions were more loyal. He will eventually get his student card. Claire didn't make it to Robin's send-off. They were now in a different format of communication. All day long, when they were free, they texted each other. Before they left, the guy asked, "Claire, will you be waiting for me after your enlistment? After all, now you only have to serve a year. Can you do that without me?" Claire was at a crossroads. She couldn't understand what it was between her and Robin. Love? Romance? Friendship? A friendly relationship with a hint of romance? It was nothing like that, almost childish kissing in the driveway. It wasn't serious. And Robin's proposal of marriage seemed to her to be a momentary mood, not a global approach to the future. Right now, studying was taking up all her time. Like other, more frivolous future stewardesses, she didn't disappear on dates and parties. Along with English, she took up Asian studies and began to learn Chinese and Korean. Stewardesses with knowledge of Asian realities were valued for their weight in gold. She passed to the second year with all excellent grades in her credits. By summer, Robin had fallen out of favor in the army. There were only a couple of months left before demobilization, and he was ready to snap, to go OL for a long time, to ruin his record with a daring act. Claire had the character trait of making decisions in the blink of an eye. She'd had enough of her parents over summer vacation. August this year had been increasingly cool and rainy. No joy. And Robin is serving in the Caucasus near the majestic mountains, around the national color of the local people, ancient fortresses, the sea, authentic dishes in cafes and canteens. She should fly to him to boost his service spirit a bit. Or are they not real friends and close people? Dad and Mom approved her idea, provided money for the trip, booked her remotely a room in a hotel near Robin's military unit. They didn't get the kids' hopes up. Let the surprise be a complete surprise. 2 days later, at the checkpoint, Claire asked for the private she needed from the barracks. Robin didn't even realize at first that she wasn't a mirage. In honor of the arrival of his favorite girl, the command of the military unit was generous. The colonel had signed Robin's leave of absence for 3 whole days. Robin and Claire hugged each other as they walked from the military garrison to the neighboring town and couldn't talk enough. They both felt that they missed each other, that everything was back to normal, that they were so good together, that all their former disagreements were just a mistake. They didn't go to the hotel. They went for a walk around the city first. Claire was so proud of the fact that next to her was a more masculine and handsome man, that she looked at their reflection in all the store windows. In the cafe, they ordered a real Caucasian lamb kebab, warm flatbread with cheese, lots of seasonal herbs and vegetables. Should we drink it all with grape wine? And again, we chatted nonstop. We couldn't believe that we seemed to have wasted so much time we could have spent together. It was late afternoon when they got to the hotel. Robin wanted to book the room next door to Claire's, but she gave him such an expressive look that he hesitated, took her hand, and pushed open the door to a cozy studio with a kitchenette and a huge bed. They fiddled around for a long while longer, watching intermittently some comedy on TV, drinking tea with cookies and honey. The sweets were compliments of the hospitable establishment. Before going to bed, Robin looked questioningly at Claire once more without further ado. She nodded affirmatively and silently too. They spent the remaining 2 days of their stay in love with each other, exploring the local landmark, an ancient fortress with many elegant tower labyrinths, and sampling a lot of national dishes. A lot of time was spent in bed, not thinking about hot embraces. By the evening of the 3rd day, Robin's leave of absence was over. He went to the military unit, and Claire went to the airport. In her hand luggage, she found a first aid kit, which didn't want to tighten because of a packet of pills that kept falling out of it. Claire shoved it back and frustratedly and was stunned. It was the birth control pills her mother had given her before the trip. Impressed by the new places and meeting her boyfriend, Claire had never even remembered them. For a couple of weeks after the trip, the young woman still hoped that the dates with Robin did not end for 2 healthy people who forgot about the existence of contraception. The logical outcome, alas, was that she began to vomit so persistently. The reaction to the smells of food was so strong that here even to the antenatal clinic could not be rushed. Even the gestational age she'd calculated with an accuracy of plus or minus 2 days. And she told Robin the news at once, so he didn't have to beat around the bush. He replied that he was happy, that he would be home soon, and that they would get married right away. They were married when she was 4 months pregnant. It was decided that she would pass the winter session and immediately go on sabbatical. The birth of a baby was more important than any dream of a brilliant career as a flight attendant. And while they rented a small apartment in the regional center, Robin got a temporary job in a car service. The parents also helped the young family waiting for a child. Their son Cameron was born to them as a healthy little boy. While the inexperienced mom everything fell out of hand, the newlyweds moved in with her parents. Where is it seen that the mother did not help her daughter in such a difficult moment? For a whole year, it was all about Cameron. Robin would come home from his job, which he'd quickly found here, and take turns walking with his grandfather in the stroller. Anyone who's raised a baby with love knows how much care and trouble it is. Everyone tried to please Cameron in the sense that he would remain as healthy and strong as ever. Except that Robin was staying late at work more and more often, under plausible excuses. While everyone was out with his son and grandson, he was earning a penny. How did he explain that to Claire? Trouble comes to a house in different ways. When it sneaks in, when it sneaks out, when it sneaks in proudly. Claire's been making friends with a mom in the yard lately. They hit it off for 2 reasons. Their husbands worked together, and their sons were born only 19 days apart. So they had a lot of common interests. One evening, Claire kept glancing at her watch. She was outside waiting for work. Why not? The weather's so nice, it's summer, it's the second battle. Mommy was in no hurry to come home. We can talk about women's things, her new friend said as she looked at the dial. What are you doing, Claire? I'm impatient. Are you waiting for your husband so insistently? But something began to be delayed almost every day. The owner of that auto body shop is getting all worked up over these second shifts. Second shifts? The young woman asked in surprise. Mine has been home for 3 hours, and before my walk with my son went to the supermarket. There is a lock on the gate of the car service center, and the alarm button is blinking. No one's been there for a long time, everything's locked up. My husband says people are on vacation. There's a lot less customers. Claire couldn't believe her ears. The lock's just like a lock, she stuttered. I'm telling you, there's hardly any orders. My husband even sometimes comes home from lunch to take a bath. Can't get him outside with the stroller. Claire's eyes darkened, cats mewed in her soul, leaving sharp scratches of doubt. She quickly picked Cameron up from the sandbox and ran home without even saying goodbye. Her phone calls were not answered by Robin. The caller was out of range. Her mind was a swarm of suspicions and fears. Now she'd just wait for him to get home from work or wherever he was and set things straight. Robin didn't come home that night. I spent the night without sleep. Cameron was fidgeting in his crib. It was as if he could sense that Mommy was worried about something. Robin showed up around noon. Claire, we need to talk, the man announced in a strange, muffled voice. I was tired of lying and twisting. Why do you have to lie every day? Said Robin. I'm in love with another woman. I'm going to pack my things and go to her. Claire felt as if the ground had fallen out from under her feet. Who had said those words now? Her Robin, who had been trying to win her favor for so long. Yes, this is a dream. It couldn't be, because it could never be. Tired, she returned and asked meekly, You're in trouble at work. So you made it all up. Dinner will be ready soon. Let's eat, rest, calm down. Robin stared at his wife with undisguised surprise. Couldn't she hear him? What kind of lunch could there be if he said such things to her? After all, he didn't want to use harsh, cruel words to Claire. He drew air into his lungs and repeated dickishly, Claire, there will be no more lunches. I'm leaving you forever. Our marriage was a mistake. I realize that now. Once again, Claire felt like she was delusional. It was him, her beloved husband, her first man, the father of her son. She looked around helplessly for some moral support. Her legs shook, her eyes swam before her eyes. Was her world going to collapse so suddenly on nothing? What other beloved woman was Robin talking about? Tears sprang from her eyes. She made an effort and rushed to her love's defense for the 3rd time. Robin, what's the story? You're telling me a story? Look at me. It's me, you're Claire. And you're my bestie. Do you remember how heroic you were in getting us tickets to that famous play? And the first time you tried to kiss me in the driveway? And I kept resisting. She didn't know what facts from their shared past she could bring to his argument. He can't leave me. It's nothing. A mistake, temporary oblivion. Even if he does have a crush on someone, they'll get over it together, and he'll be back in the family. But Robin looked at her with empty, cold eyes. He pushed away her attempt to hug him. He moved determinedly into the hallway where their large family suitcase was stored on the mezzanine. Then suddenly he gritted his teeth angrily. How to live, I am bored with my dull, gray love. with the eternal nagging for correctness. I'm already sick of you. Not a drop of fire, fantasy, desire to somehow diversify. Of course they supported her, assured her they'd always be there for her. They listened to her story of what had happened in her family, reassured her as best they could. Claire was a bit like a robot now. She lived by inertia, fiddled with her son, did something machine-like around the house, but her eyes remained dead. It seemed that the evil accidents of fate had trampled down her faith in good things. She no longer trusted men now. If she had been betrayed by the one who had spent so much time looking for mutual love in her, what could others do? Robin had started seeing Hannah again about a month before his tough talk with his wife. The woman found him at a car service center, stunned by the news. Guys, your accomplices from the ATO zone threw their boss, they'll be in jail again. And now they are free birds. They want a beautiful life. They think you owe them. They can't clean up their tongue. They can't clean up their tongue. They kept you behind your teeth. Even in your tangential case, you didn't pass. They want to go back to their old trade. But the odds will be different now. You're with them, and the whole process from start to finish will participate in the car service business. I'm getting good at it. I got a couple of garages in mind. In them, you will decide the fate of each prey, what to dismantle into parts, where the number on the body rebid and resell. Robin's soul split in two at these words. On the one hand, he was glad to see Hannah again. Claire had been good, but so quiet and peaceful that his cheekbones were starting to droop with longing. He knew by heart how she'd behave with him, and he'd forgotten every time out of boredom. Like warm, like tender, but all childishly naive. No fire and passion, no surprises. Obedient and overzealous. He still remembered how Hannah had involved him in a new plot every time, where each of them had interesting roles to play. On the other hand, associating with former so-called co-workers was dangerous. It would be too high a price to pay for the pleasure of not counting money again. Hannah, meanwhile, was watching his reaction to this conversation and grinned to herself as soon as she saw the greedy glint of unconcealed desire in his eyes. Robin had slammed the hook. She was sure of it. But success couldn't be dismissed out of hand. She knew how to secure it in the safest way possible, so she went straight to the bank. I've missed you, my sweet, yet daring boy. But you're not a boy anymore, Army family son. I followed your life closely from afar. I've always been interested in you. And now you're all grown up and handsome, and you make me want to be near you again. Or do you mind? He didn't mind at all. Now it even seemed to him that he had been writing his book of life on a draft, and only now he would start again from scratch. They were in Hannah's apartment in half an hour. He was ready to be her slave again, to get any kind of money, to fulfill her whims, as long as she didn't let him go again. He didn't remember that he had to go home to his wife and son. He would stay with her now for good. But the woman cooled his ardor. Kitten, I don't want that, and I'll give you time to think about it, even if I turn out to be the last bitch. The remnants of humanity are still alive in me. It was good teachers that made me this way. After several abortions from our leader, I can't have children. But that doesn't mean I don't want to experience the happiness of motherhood too. You men always come here for one thing. No one knows how to look into my soul. So now you, who went to your family, must decide who you want to be with. I'll give you a month. During this time, the boys and I will solve technical matters with the site for cars, make a list of vehicles, so that they are already in mind. Repeating past mistakes of thoughtlessness is no longer an option. Robin didn't want to go home, to think about why he had come home so late, to look Claire in the eye, and certainly not to fulfill his marital duty. His wife was a pretty, affectionate woman, but he realized after marriage that his first fatal school love for Hannah ended long ago, even at the desk where they were preparing for final exams together. Everything between them later had been an attempt to distract himself from Hannah, to tear her from his heart. Somewhere it had fallen in again as soon as he'd seen her today. He would definitely never let her go from him now, at any cost. At home at dinner, eyes downcast to the floor, sluggishly picking at a chicken leg, refusing his favorite salad. For the first time he looked at his son with some distaste, how he would have liked a child with his red-headed bestie, not this well-mannered, proper Claire. Alliances were not to her liking. She'd gone to bed with him like a sweetheart and married him in a hurry. Where the hell did she put her Valentine and Valentine nonsense? Shifter hunter Hannah is the real deal. He missed her like crazy already. The day after tomorrow, they're going on a case. They decided to start big with a cool, dark Maybach. Hannah liked to go big. He wanted to get back at one of his former admirers who'd declared after a night with her that she was dirty and no match for him. He used her a couple times and tossed her in the trash like a piece of junk. He didn't even thank her with gifts like other lovers. He thought he'd honored her too much already. Hannah felt particularly hurt by his behavior. She thought of her revenge, even when he almost threw her out of the luxury car on the road, adding, "A lot of self-importance. You think you can smell it on me. If I wanted to buy a small car for a woman, as you want, you wouldn't be able to afford it. But in reality, it's cheap. I can always find one like that." No one ever knew what went on inside Hannah, but her gut was scorched empty. There weren't even any coals left. So many she'd been through, so many she'd lost. She'd lost count long ago. Always drunk, the same red-haired, beautiful mother. A stepfather who showed her the way into the world of sensual pleasure. High school gym teacher. Struck out with a local gang leader, made her way into the youth gang. She went to see him on a date, and he kept joking about it. "Don't wait up for me, right? I won't punish you. I understand that it's bad for a woman without a man's caress. When I come back, so you'll be with me again. In the meantime, take a walk. I've survived without a man's presence. Only while she was with Robin, a young boy. But even he soon bored her with his puppyish devotion. She didn't need him now, except for business. She waved her finger, and he was ready to do anything for her again. But would it make her happy? I don't think so. She's long since lost all feeling. She turned into a doll only when she holds a present and a new trinket in her hands. She comes to life for a moment, then falls back into the abyss of memory. Operation Maybach went well. The owner of the expensive foreign car was too sure of his greatness. The car didn't even need to be opened. Its owner had forgotten the card without key access to the ignition button on the bar. Hannah knew perfectly well where he liked to stop for a glass or two of cognac with lemon and sugar. Robin chanted the signal while the victim was getting drunk. After that, it was all a matter of technique. Only a little damage to the wheels on the corner, and the car was so. Pity about the bird. It was a beauty that no one had the heart to ruin. But Hannah was ruthless. She'd shine before her time with such an expensive toy, and half the town would know her. And so do the inmates of my favorite prison. We'll resell it in another town. It'll be used for parts. There are already buyers who want to upgrade their cars. Yeah, the profit margin will be a lot less, but it'll do for now. Learn. It's a start. This won't be our last car haul. The men didn't dare listen to their leader's friend, and they were far less clever than Hannah, who had a marvelous knack for life, and even Robin, who had completed at least 10 years of school. The procedure of disassembly of all the units with the help of Hints and Robin's participation was carried out as smoothly as possible. A week later, they were already joking together in the restaurant, celebrating the successful deal. After the party, Robin looked hopefully at his beloved. "I miss you, Hannah. I can't think of anything else." But she just glared back at him and said, "Look at the calendar. There's a circle circled in bold red felt tip pen. 20 days you still have to think, and then either with me or with me to the end. Yeah, I've made up my mind, the moment I saw you again and followed you." But Hannah was adamant. She knew Robin wasn't going anywhere. so she was in no hurry to play family with him. The first car was followed by a second, then a fifth, then a fifth, then a 10th. The criminal ensemble had already lost count. Robin left his wife, quit the car service. Greed was pushing him, taking over, driving him around. Money always seemed tight. In between jobs, they'd binge. Sometimes Robin tried to remember that it would take a long time to fall asleep. His parents always felt sorry for him and didn't understand how he could abandon such a wonderful family and a good woman. And he was all trying grass, sinking lower and lower to the bottom after his red-haired abnormal love. Claire and Robin divorced then surprisingly quickly, without any delays. Claire herself and her parents had insisted that Robin give up their son. They promised that they wouldn't press him for child support. He signed the papers without looking at them, without reading a line. The women found Cameron a great private preschool with a strong group. Her parents became increasingly insistent on sending Claire to the capital city. How long could her sabbatical last? It was time for the student to return to her studies. For the remaining years, she tossed between the institute and her son. Cameron grew up fast, a bright little chatterbox. Claire called him my sweet parrot. She met her ex-husband by chance only once. He was all wrinkled and unattractive, hungover by all accounts. Where had his former statuesque good looks gone? He looked much older than his 23 years. You'd never tell from their looks that they'd once been in the same class. Claire, on the other hand, had blossomed and looked beautiful. In their final year, they had an internship and she lived alone in the dormitory. She wore a stewardess uniform, the beauty of which was added by her eyes burning with excitement. She did not give up her dream to master the Asian direction in air communication. She went to her cherished goal so purposefully that the teachers only marveled at how deeply she could master quite complex foreign languages and scripts. They decided to encourage the successful student. After defending her diploma, she was sent to a transportation company that carries out air transportation of passengers to China. The minimum program in the profession was closed on excellent. All significant routes of airliners flying to Asia, of course, did not start in the regional town where Claire studied the future profession. The destination in her allocation was the large city of Seattle, the main city in their region. At the family council, it was decided that little Cameron would stay with his grandparents in the stewardess's hometown, while she would settle in Seattle, get a little on her feet at work and at home. The airline welcomed the new employee with a modern design, gleaming metal and glass, and a buzz of lively voices. Claire had an interview with the head of department and an introduction to the corporate rules. A knock on the door was answered by what appeared to Claire to be a soft voice with a slight accent. "Come in, freely." A man of medium height and Asian appearance came out from behind the desk to meet Claire. Slanted, intelligent eyes looked inquisitive, but his appearance was not formidable. Rather, it was more disposing. He held out his hand to her. "My name is Bill. I don't need a middle name, because it's too hard for me to pronounce. According to your credentials, you're at my disposal as a stewardess on flights to Beijing. Come on. I'll introduce you to the girls who are here in the office now." Claire watched him move. He had the strength of a warrior and the grace of a panther at the same time. She thought to herself, Asian men are seriously different from our Americans. Bill turned around with a slight smile, as if anticipating her further questions. "I prefer to tell you about myself. I have been living in America for a long time, practically since I was born. My father is American, my mother is Chinese. Does it surprise you that I call America my country? I really do. Seattle was the city where I grew up, got my education, made my career." Claire was very surprised that her first boss had ever talked to her about himself, but he immediately explained his behavior. "I am a follower of Confucius's philosophy. I build my life on the principles he bequeathed in his writings: respect for people, loyalty, virtue, righteousness, the pursuit of knowledge, high moral principles. If you are willing to accept these tenets of his, we can work together." Oh my God, Claire thought. Confucius is all I need right now. How lucky I am to have strange men. One next to me didn't want to obey any moral laws. The other has made morality a virtue. Now I'll have to adapt to these intricate philosophical corporate rules. In the stewardess's lounge, Claire was again confronted with the philosophy of Confucius. A beautiful, she'd even say classy, poster hung across the wall that read, "Pick a job you like and you'll never have to work a day in your life." I'd have to agree with that, Claire decided to herself, and began to get to know her co-workers. And then the flights came running, the airliners flew. 8 on the road, a break and back again. Claire soon had everything mixed up, where it was night, where it was day, where it was Monday, where it was Friday. Occasionally she'd break out to her parents' house, where a grown Cameron missed her more and more. As her son's warm hands cradled her head, he whispered softly in her ear, "Mommy, Grandpa and I have already learned the letter A. It looks like a ladder. And the rest of the letters we will still learn." The woman's heart was melting, turning into pliable wax. But she soberly realized that with her flight schedule, taking her son to Los Angeles would be a mistake. Maybe then, closer to high school, he'll grow up even more and will connect, Claire thought. After another visit from her parents, Claire came down with the worst of the flu. Her rented apartment was close to the office and the airfield. She worked the flight smoothly, and then realized on the ground that her temperature was almost approaching the 40-degree mark. She was shaking, her teeth were chattering from the heat, and she could only whisper in a broken voice, "I don't feel well. Everything in front of me is floating." And she passed out. She remembered the rest vaguely, how she found herself at home, how some woman in a medical uniform leaned over her. "Was it an ambulance? Any ambulance?" Claire asked in a weak voice. "You're home," the woman replied. Claire was in a slumber for 3 days, remembering nothing but someone's hands bringing her some herbal tea. Going to the bathroom, literally up the wall, the same strong, gentle hands holding her by the waist. When she woke up on the wide bed, Bill was sleeping next to her. Claire jumped up in surprise. Claire's mind flashed. Where did he come from? Was he really the one who's been taking care of me all this time? I don't remember a thing. At that instant, after a slight rustle, her superior opened his eyes, put his finger warningly to his lips, and said quietly, "Don't ask anything. I found the keys to your apartment in your purse. After you had been given first aid in the cause of your fainting, I took the liberty of escorting you home. You were barely conscious." My wife Gail, he continued. She was gone for good when I couldn't get her out of an equally bad flu. Burned out from the high fever. Her heart couldn't take the strain. She had just recently given birth to our daughter then and was still breastfeeding her. I couldn't. There was nothing I could do. Now our daughter is growing up half orphaned. I've looked at your file, Claire. You have a son, Cameron. He can't be like my little girl. Lie down. The doctor was here this morning. He told me the crisis was over. Claire later learned that Bill had taken a family leave from work. His daughter was now at a children's sanatorium with her daycare center, and no one was waiting for him at home. They had befriended a boss who didn't care if there was gossip at work, what management had to say, or how subordinates would react. Bill explained to Claire in no uncertain terms. "You look like Gail. My heart goes out to you. I can't help it. It doesn't do you any favors. When you meet the man you love, I'll disappear. Until then, just let me be there for you." A thought flashed through Claire's mind, a kind of déjà vu. Misalliance again, as she called the relationship between somewhat different people. The higher powers want a man of a different culture, faith, religion, a fan of Confucius ideas with strange, by her standards, views on life to be around. Is it her destiny to be liked by men from other worlds? At that time, In the city where Claire's parents lived, a criminal gang was celebrating the leader's release from prison in a fancy restaurant. The table, lavishly laden with food, was crowded. Everyone wanted to show respect to their idol. This served time from call to call. In the zone, he often behaved so impudently that he blocked all possibilities to go out earlier on parole to freedom. It seemed to him that in such behavior there was a certain glamour and courage. Hannah sat next to him, grinning, his hand resting carelessly on her shoulder. Robin was the only one who wasn't having fun in all this frenzy. He realized that now he would be pushed far and away. His period of pleasure was over. And was it ever a period? The man quietly got out from behind the desk and went out into the lobby, where he came across a huge mirror. Staring into it, the smooth surface glistening in the light of the lamps, he saw what he had become. A miserable, hunched, pale man with a dull face on which there was no liveliness or joy. What had he wasted his life on? After Claire's illness, Bill acted as if they were now at work together. Everyone took this news for granted. The staff was not envious or nosy. The woman was sure that everyone thought that she and Bill had been close for a long time. And she, after Robin's rebuff about her inexperience in bed, was afraid to return to this area of relations between a man and a woman. On vacation, she brought the now-grown Cameron and Jonathan to Pittsburgh. They took many walks as a foursome, she with Lucinda, Sophia with her daughter Emma. He was very unlike American men, despite growing up in Russia. Apparently, his Chinese mother still managed to instill in him a love of mysterious China, where there is the Great Wall of China. There are so many inhabitants there that some of them live in big cities, not even in one-room apartments, but in some niches, similar to a small pencil case. A bed, a nightstand next to it, that's all the wealth. Claire flew to China regularly, but she always asked herself to make a schedule in such a way as to have time to visit her parents and son in this exotic country. She never really got to know it. Working as a stewardess no longer seemed as romantic as it used to be. After long flights, she was mercilessly tired, and there were a lot of capricious passengers. The woman's life was becoming more and more like a banal routine. Bill froze in mute expectation, and the relationship did not take the initiative, leaving the final decision to her. He touched her hands casually. He'd give her his when she got out of the car. And as time went on, she wondered, was he really insensitive? So she decided to step into the same river twice. Once, after a semblance of a family dinner together in a restaurant, she suggested that he not go home, where there was a nanny, but invited him to her place for a nightcap. He was a wise man and took her hint. "Claire," he said in the morning, "now you know me. I sincerely hope you had a good time with me. Let's think about legitimizing our relationship. I recently bought a small but very cozy house in the suburbs. I suppose the four of us will be perfectly comfortable there. But I'd like to have children with you. People will judge that these two do not burn with mutual passion, do not throw themselves into the maelstrom of love. Oh, come on. Not all marriages are made in heaven." James walked slowly up the white, worn steps. The bank of the rocky river running through the city was high. He had to climb several flights of stairs to reach the embankment. James was shivering in his old down jacket. It was a real gray November, a piercing wind, and icy grains were falling from the sky. Here by the river, the temperature was much lower than in the city. It felt like winter was approaching. James pulled his knitted hat over his ears. There was no way he was going to get sick. If he went to bed, he wouldn't be able to pay for a bed at the hostel. There'd be nothing to buy groceries with, let alone medicine, because the life of a homeless man is like a flood. What can you do? James has seen worse times. He slept on a heating duct and lived in a dumpster, surviving as best he could, but he managed to make it through, more or less get on with his life. Until the fulfillment of the main dream to buy his own home, of course, still far away, but already much better than it was. James grew up in a small village with a speaking name Oaks. Surrounding this place were groves of oaks, especially picturesque in the fall. Little James, as a preschooler, tried to draw them, these beautiful trees. And then, as he grew older, he tried to put what he saw on paper. But it just didn't work. I guess I didn't have enough talent. Childhood is the happiest and coziest time of James' life. The grown man often remembered his early years with nostalgia. And it's not even that at that time he had a roof over his head, his own bed with clean linen, a guaranteed bowl of soup every day. It's that he was loved then. He wasn't alone. His grandmother, sweet, kind Grandma Patricia, wise, forgiving, warm. It had seemed to James for a long time that she was omnipotent. It was Grandma who always found the right words to dispel her grandson's sadness and anxiety. She was the one who understood what to do in any given situation. She was respected by her neighbors. She seemed to know everything in the world. Also, Grandma was never tired. At least, James couldn't remember her sleeping. When he went to bed, Grandma was still tending to the chores, and when James woke up, she was up and about. Smart, smiling. Grandma was a sturdy woman. Tall, statuesque, energetic. She could not sit idle, always found something to do, worked, maintained the household, and raised her grandson. Yes, a grandmother. This woman did not look like a gray-haired old woman in a sharp scarf. No, James's grandmother was still young, just as he remembered her. Energetic, active, businesslike. Later, James missed her gaze, her warm embrace, her gentle, soothing voice. He sobbed at the impossibility of changing everything. Blaming himself, screaming helplessly into the void. Hopelessness. That's how James would characterize his state of mind. It was not terrible to lose the house. The guy at that time, this moment, was almost not interested. The main thing is that his grandmother was no longer there. James had no other relatives. It happened that way. In villages where almost everyone was a brother-in-law, nephew, or distant relative, it was strange. But what could be done? Grandmother Patricia had come to Oaks as a young girl after her husband, whose name was also James. Grandson was named after his grandfather. He was a good man, kind, hard-working, and skillful. And at work, at the sawmill, he was appreciated and neighbors respected. And James S.R. grew up in an orphanage. He didn't know his family, that's why, probably, he dreamed of creating a strong, big family. Once he went to work in a village almost 100 kilometers away. It's the Pines. It's a remote area. He met a beautiful, modest girl named Patricia. And so it was that they ended up getting married. James and Patricia moved to the Oaks. They became a family at James' house. James worked at his sawmill. Patricia got a job on the farm as a milkmaid. Everything was fine. Everything was fine. All right. They lived soul to soul. Both spouses dreamed of a large family and at least 5 children. But it didn't happen. The couple had a daughter, Hannah. The young parents were not going to stop at this achievement. But the years went by, and Hannah remained the only child in the family. The girl grew up beautiful, not like her mother or father. They were simple country folk, but this was white bone. Fine features, fragile figure, huge violet eyes and golden curls. A princess, indeed. The locals joked about whether Patricia had fattened up such a beauty somewhere in the city. But James had no doubts about his wife's fidelity. The man didn't know his own family and rightly assumed that his daughter had taken after one of his relatives. This was most likely the case. The girl's character matched her appearance. She was smart, capricious, self-loving. And when Hannah grew a little older and realized that she had an attractive appearance, she became proud. Hannah had simple and hardworking parents. Their family lived no worse or better than anyone else. But Hannah was sure that she deserved more. She dreamed of living in a big city and blamed her parents for not bothering to move there in their time. She demanded toys from her mother and father, then outfits and jewelry. She refused to do housework, arguing that she was not going to stay in the countryside for long, and that she needed to study, not sweep floors. Except Hannah wasn't studying. Or rather, she did study, but not at all what they teach in school. She bought magazines and tried to make herself look like one of those models that flashed on the pages of glossy editions. She did makeup, washed and painted a new face again, achieving the perfect result. I learned how to combine closet items correctly, to make different hairstyles out of my golden hair. And it all started when Hannah was about 12. Maybe even a little earlier. "I'll go to the city, become a photo model," she said. "Maybe even go abroad. But I'm not going to live in a shithole like you," Hannah said. Patricia and James looked at each other in confusion. They both blamed themselves for their daughter's behavior. But what had they done wrong? Patricia herself had grown up in absolute poverty, and even starved. That's why, probably, she tried to please her only daughter, and even a beautiful one at that. James, that in general did not know parental love and was brought up in an orphanage. What can I say? The man, spoiled, of course, long awaited his child. And yet both spouses tried to instill in Hannah basic moral principles. By their example, they showed that it is necessary to work. It is necessary to work. It is necessary to treat others with respect. Patricia taught her daughter to bake pies, to clean the house. Except that the girl from childhood rejected parental attitudes and with all her appearance showed that she dreams of a completely different life. And when she became a teenager, then James and Patricia, that only about themselves, did not listen. And they're losers and they don't think things through. "You have no right to tell me what to do," shouted at her mother and father when they tried to talk some sense into their princess and force her to learn to help them with their chores. "You don't. You've done nothing for yourselves. One works at a sawmill for a penny. The other is a dung shoveler in a barn. And there you go. I'm not like you. I want to live differently, and I will. I'll marry a rich man. Or become a model." "Who'd marry you, you inept girl?" Her father tried to talk some sense into Hannah. "You can't cook or clean. Your mother still takes care of you." "Don't worry about that. I'm not marrying a village idiot. I'm marrying a rich man. They have servants for all that," answered Hannah. Her parents could not change her mind. She became more and more capricious and more angry. She didn't want to study. She didn't help at home. All she had to do was to look at fashion magazines and spend time on the street with her friends. By the way, Hannah had plenty of admirers on the street. But how could such a beautiful girl? And it was not only boys' classmates, but also grown-up guys. That's what scared Patricia the most. They had conversations with her daughter. She just laughed in their faces. James tried to be tough, locking his wayward daughter up at home to keep her out of trouble. But Hannah always escaped, either through the window, or she got a moment when her mother and father were distracted and ran out the door. She wanted company, wanted to see admiring glances, to hear compliments. All this fueled her faith in herself, her confidence in her own irresistibility, even more convinced that she was worthy of some mythical, better life. And in another life, Beauty dreamed of getting to the other life easy way. Studying at school and then at university, she was not interested. The girl believed that it is too long and difficult. "This is for those who were unlucky enough to be born a beauty with huge violet eyes and golden curls," she said. All this was told to the grown-up James by his neighbor Claire. She called his mother Hannah Tales. His grandmother, on the other hand, never spoke ill of his mother, only sighed at her fate. Well, she also blamed herself for missing her daughter somewhere. Not looking out, James recalled. Claire, on the other hand, cut the truth straight and didn't try to soften the edges. "Your mother's a beauty, I can't say. But she's lazy. And she wasn't very bright either. She wanted to fly high. She didn't have the brains to do the math. And so it turned out the way it did. It wasn't her grandmother and grandfather's fault. They did everything for their daughter. They're good people. It's probably just genes from Henry's family. That's why he grew up in an orphanage." Who puts their kids in an orphanage like that? Misguided. And only people like Hannah. If it wasn't for Grandma, you'd have had to grow up in an orphanage too. Hannah was barely 18. She ran away from her parents' home, and not to study in the city like many other village boys and girls, but after her fiancé. A guy from the city, a student, and a local boy came to visit them once in Seneki. His friend had come to see his parents, so he brought his fellow student with him. The groom's name was Ethan. He was also a student at the university and already drove his own car. His father had given it to him for his coming of age. Ethan was handsome and stylish, just like an actor from a youth show. Naturally, Hannah immediately met him. The village beauty charmed the young man. They had an instant romance. But Ethan took Hannah to the city. They started living together in his apartment. Ethan was studying, Hannah was a housewife. She didn't even study to get a foothold in the city. Cooking, scrubbing floors, that's all she did. Ethan and Hannah lived a well-to-do fun life thanks to the young man's father's money going out to clubs and restaurants, even traveling. Naturally, James went to the city and tried to bring his wayward daughter home. He understood where this was going, but she flatly refused to go, and there was nothing he could do. Hannah was already 18, so she had the right to run her own life as she saw fit. Hannah had spent too much time in the village. Her parents got her a job as a clerk in the local store, since she didn't want to study. She lived a miserable existence, dreaming of a beautiful life. She was angry at her fate, at her father and mother, at the local village boys who could not fulfill her dreams. What kept her from running away to the city, even to nowhere, were her parents. They were endlessly urging her to get smart, lecturing her, controlling her adult daughter, explaining it all with fear for her future. Hannah would have run away from them without a shame, but where and on what money? The girl tried to send her photos to a modeling agency, but to her own surprise, she did not receive any answers. Hannah thought that the offers would come at her like a cornucopia, but no such luck. She continued to think over the plan, communicated on dating sites, received a lot of compliments and offers, but she was afraid. Hannah hadn't seen these people in person. There's no telling who might be out there on the other side of the monitor. It was her parents who planted those fears in her, which made her hate them even more. And then Ethan showed up, a prince in a black Audi. He rescued the beautiful girl from captivity, took her away from the hated, dirty village, poor parents, moralizing. That's how Hannah perceived her departure. She had escaped, broken free. It didn't work out with Ethan. In the end, he quickly found someone else. But Hannah was in no hurry to return to the village. She had a new beau, lower in status than Major Ethan, but not bad either. That relationship didn't work out either. But a new one loomed ahead. Hannah lowered the bar in the choice of suitors. The suitors changed one after another. One thing remained unchanged: the girl lived at the expense of these people, gave them her tenderness, youth, beauty, and in return received a roof over her head, food, some gifts, trips to cafes and clubs. Life seemed to Hannah not quite what she had dreamed of, but she wasn't going back to the village. James and Patricia were heartbroken to see what their daughter was becoming. Her once golden curls had faded, her voice rough and hoarse. Her skin took on an unhealthy hue. Hannah drank heavily, started smoking. All this, of course, reflected on her health and appearance. James was very worried about the path his only daughter had taken. It was a huge shock to her father. Patricia hoped that Hannah would come to her senses and get her mind right. She'd had enough of such a life with one man, then another. And they were not such wealthy and handsome young men as Ethan. They were more like battered men of marginal appearance. James and Patricia worked somewhere, so they had money, and Hannah lived in the city at the expense of her admirers. She'd been transformed from a golden-haired princess into a gray woman with a dysfunctional appearance. It was hard to imagine that she had once looked so different. She had dreamed of a rich, beautiful life, spent hours perfecting her makeup. Hannah was going downhill fast and didn't seem to notice it at all. She felt happy and didn't want to go back to her parents. James's heart ached for his daughter, literally. The man had suffered 2 heart attacks in a row. Patricia was also worried, of course, but in her heart she hoped that everything would be all right. Hannah was still very young. But James, it seems, realized that nothing good could come out of Hannah. He didn't survive a 3rd heart attack. So Patricia was left all alone in the village house. No husband. Daughters living a wild life in the city. Yeah, it's not how she imagined her old age. At least she had a job. The woman still worked as a milkmaid on the farm. There's socializing, some kind of life there. And at home? Loneliness, cold, 4 walls. On New Year's Eve, an unprecedented event happened. Hannah came to her mother in the village. Patricia, seeing the dear guest, immediately began to clutter, to collect the table. Her daughter did not look well, pale, swollen face. When Hannah took off her jacket, Patricia gasped. Her belly was rounded under her sweater. Hannah was pregnant, and it looked like she'd been pregnant for a long time. It turned out that the father of the child is another suitor, Hannah Trucker. He rented an apartment in the city, earned good money, enough to live on, and to get drunk when he was not on a trip. Pregnancy, of course, no one planned. It just happened. Learning about what happened, the admirer was frightened. He admitted that he already has a family in another city, a wife and 2 children. He doesn't need heirs on the side. Gave him money to solve the problem. But Hannah was turned away at the hospital. All the terms were out, but there were no indications to terminate the pregnancy, as the child was developing well. It was surprising, considering that Hannah, being pregnant, did not deny herself alcohol. Further, everything was ridiculously banal. The admirer ran away, quickly disappeared. Hannah lived in their apartment for a few more months until the lease was up, but she had nowhere to go. Who would want her? She couldn't get another boyfriend, so she returned to her home village. Patricia hoped things would get better for them now, and the fact that the child will not have a father, so it's not a problem. She would manage, raise him, teach him, put him on his feet. The woman was counting on Hannah's maternal instincts to kick in, to change her and make her softer, more loving, more caring. It didn't work out. Hannah barely survived to give birth in the hated village. By the way, the baby was born prematurely weak and very small. He was nursed in the hospital for almost a month. Hannah immediately gave up her son. She didn't need him. And here and premature, obviously sick. So she gave up the baby at the hospital and went back to the city. Now she could again live in her own pleasure, go to cafes and restaurants in search of new love. Have fun without a belly. Everything is better. Everything is easier. After learning about her daughter's deed, Patricia rushed to the maternity hospital, explained the situation to people. She was understood. The refusal documents were canceled. Patricia's neighbor's niece worked there as head doctor. That's how it was resolved through her. But we had to find Hannah. The baby's mother had to be present and sign the paperwork. Hannah at first insisted that she did not need her son, and it would be better for him to go to an orphanage. But Patricia convinced her daughter the boy should stay in the family. She found arguments. I will take care of him. Do not be afraid. Live as you have lived. But you'll get an allowance for him, and a lot of money. You're a single mom. Patricia took this step for her grandson. Convinced her daughter to agree to it because of child support. Otherwise, Hannah would never have kept the baby, and Patricia would not have been given custody, and the conditions are not ideal, and the age is already solid. So little James stayed with his grandmother in the village. His mother, the beautiful Hannah, James knew only from the stories of his grandmother, neighbors, and their photos. The woman was not interested in the fate of the child, only occasionally came to his mother to rest between the next complex novels. A vague image remained in James's memory, a woman who smelled pungent, hoarse, unpleasant. She was yelling at his grandmother, demanding something, and little James was scared. But of course he couldn't remember his parent well, because Hannah had died when he was barely 4. Another roommate in a drunken brawl did not calculate forces. That's how Hannah's life ended quite naturally. His grandmother told James many times that she had survived that period, after Hannah's death, only because of the little grandson she had to take care of. They didn't have much money, times were hard, and a milkmaid's wages were not luxurious. But James considered his childhood happy, energetic, strong, caring grandmother, friends, soft bed, the aroma of pies and fried potatoes. Yes, James did not have an expensive computer, game consoles, branded sneakers, what is considered the ultimate joy for teenagers. But he never went hungry or wore rags. James tried to help his grandmother with everything. Growing up, he realized that life at home and loved one was not easy. Restless boy tried to please her as much as he could. True, to study well did not work. Grandmother engaged with him, tried to explain complex topics, but did not add up something in his head. And that's it, said the neighbor of the grandmother, Claire. That's because Hannah drank while she was carrying him. They were sitting in the kitchen drinking tea and thought James couldn't hear a thing. Yeah, but who cares? Grandma waved her hand. The main thing is that he's healthy, strong and kind. Not everyone has to be a scientist. And James will find his place in life. He's so handy. Like his grandfather, I suppose. James was really good at fixing things, making things, that's him. And no one taught him how to do it on purpose. He watched other people do it and picked it up on the fly, not like math. By the time James finished school, the financial situation of their small family had completely deteriorated. The farm paid a pittance. His grandmother's pension was also very small, especially compared to the ever-increasing prices. James worked part-time, mending neighbors' fences and cutting people's grass, digging potatoes, even helping to build houses. But the earnings were irregular and small. With those grades in the certificate, James had no sense to think about college, let alone university. But the boy still decided to go to the city. There are more opportunities to earn money there, to settle in life. And his grandmother needs financial help. She's been dragging him down so much already. Go, Patricia said yes. You're a serious guy with a backbone. I'm not as worried about you as I was about Hannah. You won't be lost. You won't go off the straight and narrow. Just be careful. You're still young, and there's so much danger out there. Don't worry, Grandma. James put his arm around his grandmother's shoulders. Everything will be fine. I'll go to the construction site as a laborer. I can knead cement, lay bricks, and plaster and paint. I'm a jack of all trades, in general. I'll definitely find a use for me there. I'll earn for an apartment, and I'll take you right away. Grandmother smiled, but her eyes were still sad, even though she'd said James wouldn't be lost. She must have had a premonition of trouble. The city stunned James at first. Crowds of rushing people, streams of cars. No, the boy, of course, had been to the city before. But it was one thing to come with his grandmother to do some shopping or file some paperwork, and quite another to be here for a long time alone, to become a resident of this noisy metropolis. Where to start? Where to go? James found several advertisements in advance back in the village. At the construction site often needed workers. So he decided to try young, strong. This guy was gladly hired to build another supermarket. The object was almost ready. Finishing works were left. The crew was running out of time. They needed helpers. James fit the bill. He was even provided with accommodation, a caravan hut. True, he had to share it with the workers, but it was nothing, but it was free. Having received the first money, James immediately rented an apartment. He wanted to start looking for a new job, but the job found him. One of the workers, who lived with James in the apartment, called him to the new object. They'll pay well, the bearded man assured him. As soon as we get the results, we'll get the money. James didn't object to this settlement scheme. He had money saved from his previous earnings, so he didn't worry about what he would have to live on all this time. The work was going on, the arguments. James was anticipating that pretty soon he would have some good money. Then he could send some of it to his grandmother. He knew she had debts, borrowing from neighbors to send her grandson to the city. She was afraid to let the guy go without any money at all. Soon he'll pay her back with a raise. She'll be so happy. It didn't work out. This time the owners simply screwed the laborers. Maybe it was the bearded man who took James' money and ran off with it. Maybe he was the cheater, realized James was a naive rookie. It was useless to appeal to the police or the labor inspectorate. No one signed official contracts with the workers. No one would take his word for it. James was in a desperate situation. The money he had set aside had run out. He had no money to pay the rent, and there was almost no money left for bread. James spent days running around the city looking for work. As luck would have it, unskilled laborers were not needed anywhere. And then one day, after another unsuccessful attempt to get a job at a construction site, James wandered towards the bus stop. He was filled with a variety of unpleasant feelings: fear, despair, resentment. And then someone called out to him. "Hey kid, are you looking for a job?" James turned around. Behind him stood two guys about 25 years old, tall, tanned to black. They were construction laborers. They work on the street, hence the calluses, the tanned faces, and the broad palms, glowing with mud. "I'm looking," James nodded. "And just because we need help. It's not a big deal. Just one thing to unload into a car. But the pay is good." A doubt crept into James's soul. What if he was being deceived again? He didn't want to step on the same toes again. He wanted to try to get an official job. But there was no way out. He had to stay in the city to find a job. You gotta pay rent, you gotta have money for food. So he decided to take a risk. "I'm with you," he said. "All right," replied the man. "So we'll meet here tonight at 11 o'clock. 11 o'clock tonight," James clarified, and it seemed strange. Why so late? "The owners are leaving late. We'll go in after them, start taking everything out. They don't want to be involved in all this fuss, so they're paying well." James shrugged. The rich have their quirks. "I'll be there," he promised his new acquaintances. James was there at the right time. The guys he'd arranged with were late, or maybe they wouldn't show up at all. James wouldn't be too upset. Sure, he needed the money, but these men looked too suspicious. There was insincerity in them, falseness. James kept thinking they'd cheat him, not pay him, like the bearded man. But the guys showed up a few minutes late, but they came. Or rather, they arrived when an old, broken-down, open-body truck pulled into the parking lot. James didn't even look at it, didn't even think it was after him. But the driver's door swung open, and one of James' daytime companions looked out. "What are you standing there for? Get in. We're already late," he said. James obeyed and got into the seat next to the driver. The other guy was here too. He said a discreet hello and stared out the window again. Unlike his buddy, this second guy was silent and frowning. They drove for a long time, almost an hour, first through the city, then the highway, then a country road. Everything that was happening seemed increasingly suspicious to James, but he realized that at this point there was unlikely to be a quick and easy way out of the case. At best, the two men would drop him off at night without a dime in his pocket somewhere outside the city. At worst. He didn't even want to think about that. The driver was joking now and then, smiling. James had a strong feeling that he was playing the brave guy, trying to seem calm and relaxed, but he was worried. The other was silent, as usual. He didn't react to his buddy's words, just stared at the road. Finally, the truck stopped near a plot of land enclosed by a high fence. The driver opened the gate with a key. James exhaled as long as he had the keys. Then everything was really okay. "You stay in the yard. We're going in the house," the driver ordered. "We'll be handing you the boxes. You put them in the back of the truck. We'll be done in no time." The boys went into the house. James noted that they also had a key to the front door. It was silent and dark, the kind of darkness that only happened in the countryside. Large stars peered down from the sky. James involuntarily admired the night sky. He thought of his hometown. He thought of his grandmother, wondering what she was doing now. Probably drinking tea with Grandma Claire in the cozy kitchen. And old women were always talking about him, about James. I felt like going home to the only person I'd ever known. He wanted to be a little boy again, for whom his grandmother was a loving and all-powerful being. The driver's hoarse voice interrupted James from his pleasant thoughts. "What are you dreaming about?" "Standing like a pillar. Take the box." James obediently dragged the container into the truck as agreed. The box was heavy. I wondered what was inside: books, dishes, maybe just some household stuff. No sooner had James returned to the front porch than the silence of the September night was broken by the wail of a police siren. The darkness was struck by the glow of a flashing beacon. James had hoped that the police cars would drive past the station to the scene of the accident, but they stopped right outside the gate. What happened next happened quickly. James's brain was fixating on individual frames. Here the garden fills with uniformed men. Some of them rush into the house. Another part starts to search the plot. James is rolled to the ground lightly, as if he weighs nothing. His arms are twisted painfully behind his back. His face is tickled by dry grasses. Sand is stuffed into his nose and mouth. James sneezes once or twice. It's hard to breathe. Someone roughly turns James' face sideways. The boy gulps greedily for air. On the dark womb of a police van, James sits handcuffed on a hard bench. There are uniformed men nearby. The driver and the other guy are nowhere to be seen. They seem to have escaped. That's what James deduces from the scraps of phrases exchanged between the law. "Where are your accomplices?" James is approached by a stout man in camouflage. "Do you know where they went?" James shakes his head negatively. He wants to explain to these people that those who ran away are not his accomplices, that they met for the first time only this morning, that these guys just offered him a job, and James needed the money. But James doesn't say anything. First of all, they're not likely to believe him. The guy replayed his speech in his head and realized it sounds very improbable. Secondly, his tongue became alien from fear, as if it were too big and clumsy. And my mouth was dry. He was very thirsty, but James didn't dare to ask the policeman for water. "Do you even know whose cottage you are going to rob?" The man in the camouflage turned to the terrified boy again. "Samantha's attorney. The summer house." "I'll give you assholes the full program now," said the man in camouflage. Then James was interrogated. The investigator, a middle-aged man with a tired, angry look, asked him questions like a hardened criminal. James told the truth. He wasn't believed, of course. Who would have doubted it? The two men had escaped, gone into hiding. They were being searched for. James had assumed that the cops wouldn't succeed. Now, he was sure he'd met experienced criminals. They'd probably get away with it. James knew that the grandmother had tried several times to appeal for leniency for her grandson, even hired lawyers. But it hadn't worked out. James had answered to the full extent of the law, and only because the victims included a prosecutor. And those people are known to have a lot of connections. How many times during these 8 years James dreamed of going back to that unfortunate day and refused the offer of two strangers to earn money? His whole life would have turned out differently. "It's okay, grandson." "With everything happens," calmed his grandmother. "Calm down, everything will be all right." James tried to be brave in front of her. But she saw everything, understood everything. "You've been duped, it's all right. The price is high, but it's just the beginning of life. When you get out, we'll make up for it. Everything will be fine," she said. James smiled. His grandmother's words made him feel lighter and warmer. and it really did feel like everything would work out. The main thing was that he had someone who loved him, who waited, who would never deceive or betray him. And then his grandmother suddenly disappeared. James was worried when she didn't show up for his birthday. Usually she always showed up by that date, and then there was no sign of her. His grandmother's phone didn't answer. James asked the guards several times for permission to use his cell phone. The guards were kind people too, even though they weren't supposed to be. They let the prisoners make calls. But these calls were useless. Just long beeps, that's all. And then James finally got called to the visiting room. The guy flew there like he was on wings. He was relieved. He imagined hugging his grandmother, telling her he missed her so much. But on the familiar gray sofa sat his neighbor, Grandma Claire. She was tense, anxious. "Hello, James," she said, hugging her neighbor awkwardly. "You've lost a lot of weight. Don't they feed you here?" Then, in a broken voice, wiping her eyes with her handkerchief, Grandma Claire told James the terrible news. "Patricia's dead. She had a heart attack. So the ambulance didn't get here in time. How was I supposed to wait for you? I was dreaming, making plans," sobbed Grandma Claire. You could see that she had not yet come to terms with the loss of her friend neighbor. "I couldn't wait. The neighbors organized the funeral. I thought someone was trying to get you to go and say goodbye to your grandmother. No way. It's not allowed. That's all. Not that they didn't let me go. They didn't even tell me about the tragedy." "How come? How could it be?" James mumbled. "How can I come home and she's gone?" "There's nowhere to go." Claire looked at him confused. "Don't you know that?" It turns out that after James went to prison, Grandma Patricia had taken out a lot of loans. Thought a good lawyer would get her favorite grandson out of jail. Only it didn't work out even with good lawyers. The loans were secured against the house. Consequently, when the owner died, the property went to the bank. It was another blow, much less sensitive than the first, but still. The house isn't just a house. It's James's place of power. A quiet, cozy harbor with which the guy has a lot of pleasant associations, warm memories. And now what? Someone alien would live there. Since then, James felt lonely and not needed by anyone. No grandmother. Then why is he on this earth? What for? He used to think to please his grandmother, to watch over her in her old age. He was working hard for her, striving for something. Now what's it all for? But you've got to make a living. So James adapted to the cold and darkness of prison. He ate, slept, worked, everything was automatic. His mind was constantly replaying scenes from his childhood, when his grandmother was still young and strong. And he promised her that he would support his grandmother in her old age. But the grandmother never lived to be old. Liberation did not bring the expected joy. Rather the opposite. Where to go, what to do, where to sleep, what to eat. There were more questions than answers. At least James had a small amount of money saved up over the years of working in the industrial zone. He went to the city with it. Where else? He's bruised. James realized that no one was waiting for him in the village, even though Grandma Claire said she'd be willing to take him in. She invited him to visit her after his release, but the guy realized that these were just polite words. Why would she want a felon in her house? In the city, James spent money on hotel and food. The savings melted away in a week, but it was also the beginning of hard times. There were a lot of things and had to sleep on the street and get into street fights and eat from the dumpster. James got sick a couple times, so he thought he'd never make it. And even was glad of this outcome, but the young body recovered again and again. And no one needed gray, dull, joyless life continued. James tried begging. He got a serious beating for it. It turned out to be a whole business, and you can't just enter it by choice. The guy went through the dumpsters and the bins near restaurants and cafes. There was always something to eat. And in the city dump, you could find clothes in season. James didn't even want to think about what he'd become. A dirty, ragged bum. If his grandmother had seen him. No, this wasn't how he'd imagined growing up. He was disgusted with himself. Then one day James was walking past a house under construction and noticed that the workers weren't laying the tiles correctly. It turned out that not all the construction skills were out of his head yet. The foreman was surprised, looking at the homeless man incredulously. Then followed his advice, appreciated the result, smiled, and the unbelievable happened. James was offered a job. Of course, he jumped at the opportunity. The foreman's name was Henry. He had his own small construction company. The guys were engaged in minor repairs, construction of small buildings, and the crew needed some smart guys. So James got a job. The pay, of course, was not much, but the man was happy about it. After so many years of hunger and wandering, a permanent job seemed like a gift from fate. Henry appreciated James for his diligence and dexterity. Over time, he learned the young man's story and helped him settle into life a little. For example, he told him that it was not necessary to rent a whole apartment or live in a hotel. It was too expensive. It is much more profitable in James's position to sleep in a hostel. It turns out that in the city there are such budget lodgings, huge rooms filled with bunk beds. To rent a place for the night in such an establishment cost a penny. Now James was falling asleep in a warm bed. Dozens of neighbors snored around him, but that didn't bother the man, who was used to much harsher conditions. James had a job to do. He no longer slept outside, and Henry had become something of a mentor to the man who'd been thrown to the wayside, helping him with paperwork, big purchases, hospitalizations, and so on. Henry advised James to start saving for his own place. You can't stay in a hostel forever. A man needs his own place, even if not a luxurious apartment, but at least a small one on the outskirts, so that there was a place to lay his head. And James began to save little by little, month by month. The man always kept his savings with him. He made a secret pocket in his shirt. When Henry found out about it, he grabbed his head. Are you out of your mind? Who does that? How? James didn't understand. Where am I supposed to leave them? Like burying a treasure in the ground in the woods? Not as treasure, but as a deposit. You and I are going to open a bank account. James was afraid to entrust his hard-earned money to a bank. He'd been cheated many times in his life, and brutally so, but Henry convinced him. And now homeless James even had his own account. The man funded it with regularity. The numbers kept climbing. Someday James would be able to realize his dream and buy a house or an apartment. Living in a hostel had its advantages. James often met a variety of people. Amazing fates, sometimes complicated, sometimes even scary. Lots of different stories. People in the hostel were like fellow travelers on trains, generously sharing details of their life stories with each other. It was fascinating. James regretted that he'd never learned to read and write. If he had been able to write well, he would have published a thick collection of stories. People would be interested in reading about the lives of others. Some of the stories were a veritable treasure trove of wisdom and experience. One day, the bunk shelf next to James's bed was occupied by a new neighbor. He was a man a little older than James himself. He didn't come alone, but with a boy about 6 years old. The child and the man looked uncannily alike. The same green eyes with a slightly sly squint, copper-red hair, and a face and hands like pushkins. It's clear at once father and son. Henry and Louis is small. Louis, like most of the hostel's permanent residents, had a hard history with these people. James recognized it around the third, fourth day of being neighbors with a red-haired couple. Henry, much like James, had grown up in the village. He had been raised by his mother. The man never knew his father. They lived poorly, but they didn't starve. There was always food in the house. His mother worked, Henry studied, tried hard. He had a dream of becoming a lawyer. It seemed to the boy that people in this profession are practically heavenly. They help resolve disputes, do justice, and, importantly, earn good money. So they can afford an apartment in a big city, a beautiful car, travel to the sea. "You see, I wanted to take my mother to the sea," Henry told James in a confidential whisper. The lights were off in the room. There was the sound of snoring coming from the many bunks in the hostel. Little Louis was asleep, too, curled up under the blanket. Henry and James were having a conversation. A pleasant, almost friendly conversation. James told his neighbor about his fate. It happened by itself, simply and naturally. And Henry responded with frankness to frankness. Henry realized that it was hard for his mother to carry him alone. He wished he could grow up, get on his feet, make her life a fairy tale. Mother had never been to the sea. She couldn't pay for such a trip, but she dreamed of going. Henry saw she watched movies about the sea, took a long look at pictures of acquaintances from beach vacations. I think she even dreamed about the sea. Anyway, Henry entered college to study law, went to the city, settled in a dormitory. His mother stayed in the village. The boy's dreams were shattered gradually. He learned that lawyers are not always on the side of truth. Often you have to adjust to the situation, to people. This was discovered in practice in court, and the tasks that are solved by representatives of this profession often have nothing to do with something heroic. The majority of lawyers are engaged in real estate registration, or at all papers, or going through in offices for pennies. That's how one of the college professors put it. And Henry had no reason not to trust him. The kid's down. He thought it was worth it to enroll, and that's it. Fate was settled. A happy future was guaranteed. But no. Still, Henry tried. He studied. After all, there were other lawyers, fighters for justice, defenders of the wronged and oppressed. It was hard to break through, of course, but there's always a chance. A small one, though. The older Henry grew, the clearer he realized that everywhere you need connections and money. And he, a country boy, had neither. Henry finished his college and got a job in the housing and utilities sector, working for a pittance, just as the teacher had predicted. There were plenty of lawyers looking for work at the time, so the inexperienced college graduate was glad to have the job. Now he's on the labor exchange. He rented a room in a dormitory and adjusted his life. His mother was happy for her son. After all, in the city he got a grip, made his way. She was the only person who believed in Henry's brilliant future. And this faith kept the guy afloat, forced him to move forward. He worked in the housing and utilities sector, but was looking for more interesting options. No luck, though. All the good jobs were occupied firmly and for a long time. It seems that there were even queues of the right people for them. But Henry tried not to be discouraged. He had little doubt that sooner or later luck would smile on him. And then his mother died. Henry lowered his head. Even in the semi-darkness, James could see that the man was barely holding back tears. It was obvious that the wound had not yet healed. The heart. And as the doctors said later, he should have gone to the hospital for surgery a long time ago. And Mom. She kept thinking it would go away, taking pills, putting off going to the hospital. I know why they wouldn't let her off work. No, of course they would have. Sick leave, sick leave. But while she was getting treatment, they would have fired her somehow. They'd find a way. It's happened in our village before. Everyone needs healthy young workers. And Mom? She was afraid of being left without money because she had no one to rely on. I was no good as a protector and benefactor. I was barely making ends meet myself. How could I blame myself for that? For not being my mother's rock. I didn't have the time. Henry was taking the loss hard. The realization came gradually. James understood his tablemate as well as anyone. Henry's story seemed to take him back to the time when he was suddenly without his grandmother. James had felt the same way, and he too had blamed himself endlessly for not keeping his loved ones safe. I don't know what would have happened to me in the end, Henry continued. Maybe I would have lived like a robot. Maybe I would have done something stupid. All sorts of thoughts were running through my head at the time. It's hard to even think about it now. But then Shelley came into my life. And everything started to, I don't even know how to explain it. Anyway, she got me out. Shelley got a job as a janitor at the same utility company where Henry worked. She was a sweet, modest girl with constantly troubled gray eyes framed by fluffy eyelashes. Henry didn't notice her at first. Newcomers often showed up and then left. The turnover was due to a combination of heavy workloads, neglectful bosses, and very modest salaries. But one day the guy literally bumped into Shelley in the hallway. He was in a hurry to get to the next office and bumped into a girl moving toward him. How did he not notice? Shelley gasped. Henry grabbed her by the shoulders, holding her up so she wouldn't fall. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. He was about to continue on his way when he saw her eyes. No, of course, Henry had met Shelley before in the yard at work, in line at the cash register, and in general. He'd glimpsed her in the cafeteria, but he'd never noticed her. After his mother's death, everything around him was gray and inexpressive. There was little that interested Henry, little that attracted his attention. But those eyes were bottomless lakes, impossible to look away from. Touching eyes like a Disney cartoon. So much anxiety in them, so much awe. Henry suddenly felt like someone strong, confident, almost omnipotent. He wanted to be near her, to take care of her, to protect her from the dangers of this life. For the first time since the tragedy, the boys suddenly felt alive. They stopped right there in the corridor. Each of them had forgotten where they were going. Henry apologized for running into the girl, smiled. Shelley began to assure him it was no big deal. Word by word, and somehow the young people agreed to go on their first date. That's the story of an acquaintance. It soon became clear that Shelley and Henry had a lot in common. First, they were the same age. Secondly, at their young ages, both are already having to make their own way in this life. Neither Shelley nor Henry had any older relatives ready to help them in life, to become mentors and support, or close friends. That's just the way it is. Shelley grew up in an orphanage. She knew nothing about her parents except that both were alcoholics on the street. That's the characterization the teacher used when she told the girl about her past. The child was taken away from the marginalized couple because the girl was in danger with her parents. Did these people love her? Were they trying to bring her back? Shelley didn't know for sure, but she assumed not. Because if to other pupils at least sometimes someone came swollen, unkempt mothers with dirty lollipops, strange-looking homeless fathers, decrepit grandmothers lowered, lost, but still relatives and not indifferent people, then Shelley in general nobody and never visited. And she wanted to see her own, to feel their love. The girl would forgive these people everything, would accept them and understand. But no one came. Life in the orphanage was not easy. Cruel children, angry teachers. Quiet, humble Shelley had a hard time. She lived her life waiting for the next blow, the next bullying. The kids sensed the quiet ones and used them for their own amusement. Shelley was locked in a dark bathroom at night. She was robbed of New Year's gifts donated to orphanages from the city government. Her clothes were often stained with paint or plasticine. More than once Shelley was beaten just to show her strength and superiority. And the girl could neither fight back nor complain. One day Shelley told the teachers about the bullying of her peers. She herself was blamed. Adults said that she needed to be more communicative. She needed to find a common language with other people. Scared her with diagnoses. But the offenders were punished. But Shelley didn't feel any better. On the contrary, she was then spotted in the yard, dragged behind the gazebo and beaten again for complaining. The girl never asked adults for help again. Shelley didn't study very well, and she would have liked to be an excellent student. She reached for knowledge, read a lot, but it did not work. It was impossible to learn her lessons. Other pupils interfered, they made noise, molested, and even, sometimes, took away notebooks and textbooks. In the orphanage, striving for knowledge and diligent study was considered something shameful. Shelley was called a nerd. Bookworm was demeaned. In general, no one in the orphanage really studied, and the teachers gave lessons for a tick. Once Shelley even heard a conversation between teachers. The math teacher contemptuously threw the teacher of Russian, "Why are you prostrating yourself in front of these morons? They won't be of any use anyway. They'll follow in the footsteps of their miserable parents, or bruises won't be born oranges." Shelley had tears in her eyes. Is that how they treat them? No. She'd known before that the orphanage's residents weren't particularly favored. But it was one thing to assume, but it was another to hear herself say it. The worst part was, Shelley knew the teacher was right. That's just the way it is. Probably having overheard that conversation, Shelley realized it's not worth dreaming about happiness, about a bright future. Nothing good was going to happen to her, and she shouldn't even try. Shelley went to college to become a pastry chef. She studied, knowing full well that she was unlikely to find a place in her specialty. It was too narrow a specialty, and she wasn't very good at it. Her hands did not obey well and could not repeat the operations that the teachers showed her. Shelley realized at the beginning that this was not her path, but all the orphans, their girls, were sent to learn to be pastry chefs. So she was sent. "It's okay," the group's supervisor, an unexpectedly warm-hearted, caring woman, reassured her. She somehow immediately took to Shelley, took pity on her, which was quite unusual. Not many people work in the profession. "You'll find yourself in life now. Girl, don't worry." Having reached adulthood, Shelley graduated from the orphanage. It was a day she greeted with joy. Deliverance at last. A confusing adult life lay ahead. Now she'd have to make her own way. No one is responsible for her now. But at least the end of bullying peers and cruel punishments of educators. Shelley was given an apartment on the outskirts of town by the state. It's an old 3-story house. Creaky floors, piles of garbage. The room was tiny, but it was her own place. An island of tranquility where Shelley found herself a full-fledged mistress. At first, the girl was even dizzy. She could do whatever she wanted, cook something delicious in her own kitchen, lie in bed and read without fear that someone would take her book away from her. Watch late into the night on a hand-bought TV, an old, cracked screen. So what? It works. For the first time, Shelley lived on the money that had accumulated in her account during her stay in the orphanage. Each pupil received a certain amount of money, but the graduates were warned that they had to find a job before the savings ran out. Shelley knew it was really important. She'd seen how fast the money was being spent, especially since at first she was inexperienced and didn't know how to save money. Then she learned how to save money, and then a wonderful thing happened. Shelley told her husband that she was expecting a child. The couple didn't seem to be planning an heir so soon, but the news made them both happy, of course, and it was scary how they would cope with the baby. They do not have anyone who would help, who would prompt, and whether they have enough money for such a luxury. And yet joyful emotions clearly prevailed in the range of stormy feelings of the future parents. Henry took a risky step. He quit his job at the housing and utilities company, which paid pennies, and got a job as a lawyer for a private lawyer. The latter offered him a much more respectable salary, but also more work. He had to study a lot, to understand the nuances of complicated cases, to sit in the office late into the night. Henry did it so that Shelley could quit her job. He rightly believed that the physical labor of janitorial work could be bad for the pregnancy. The man's salary was now quite high, but he was a private citizen. His business had its ups and downs and was sometimes jeopardized. Still, Henry didn't regret his decision. Shelley settled down at home and took over the household. Both spouses looked forward to the arrival of the baby. And then he was born small, warm, shrieking from the first days, looking remarkably like his father, the same green eyes and red hair. Shelley and Henry melted into the care of the baby. The boy was named Louis. Shelley had decided that. It was the name of one of her favorite book characters. Henry didn't mind Louis, a wonderful name. It turned out that a baby was really quite expensive: diapers, special food, clothes that the baby grew out of lightning fast. Not to mention medicines, strollers, cribs, toys. Henry was getting by. He worked hard just so his family wouldn't need anything. They had food, they had necessities, they paid their rent. Of course, the young family couldn't afford anything extra. Trips to the sea, dinners in restaurants, expensive gadgets, all this was still inaccessible. But the spouses were not discouraged. It seemed to both of them that everything was still ahead of them. Shelley was busy with the baby in the house. Henry was working, and all would have been well, except that with Louis' arrival, Shelley's cramped apartment had become a mess. Not only did the number of tenants increase, but also the amount of stuff. Soon the couple realized they needed to expand. Louis was growing up. He needed more and more space, ideally his own room. A studio apartment would do, but then at least it would be newer and more spacious. And the family didn't particularly like the neighborhood. School and kindergarten were far away. The nearest bus stop was also about a 15-minute walk away. That's okay in the summer, but in the winter, it's a long walk. So Henry and Shelley thought about it and decided they needed a mortgage. The money for the down payment could be obtained from the sale of Shelley's cramped old apartment and Henry's country house, inherited from his mother. Of course, it was a risky endeavor, losing the whole place and going into debt all at once. But Henry had a good salary at the time. Louis was getting older, and the time was approaching when Shelley would be able to go to work. The payment seemed manageable to the couple, and so it began. At first, everything was going just fine. They found buyers quickly, even for the farmhouse, although Henry sensed big problems with it. The proceeds went partly toward the down payment on the mortgage, partly toward renovations. Shelley and Henry took a spacious one-bedroom apartment in a new neighborhood, bright, clean, and no one had ever lived in it before. The renovation was done quickly. They had the money. They furnished the rooms with inexpensive but fresh and modern furniture. They hung beautiful curtains and decorated the walls with framed photographs. The pictures were of Shelley, Henry, and little Louis. Henry liked to remember the first New Year's Eve in the new place. They had just finished remodeling. The room still had that distinctive smell of glue and new furniture straight from the store. Beautiful, clean, cozy. A huge, almost ceiling-high Christmas tree occupied the corner of the living room near the window. Little Louis, in his funny pajamas, stared mesmerized at the flashing lights of the garlands that decorated the fluffy beauty. The overhead lights went out. The garlands and the flickering TV screen created a cozy, almost fairy tale atmosphere. Henry looked at his wife and son sitting on the couch and at the neatly set table with incredibly tasty dishes: potatoes and chicken, salads, fruit, and of course champagne. What's New Year's Eve without champagne? At that moment, Henry felt happy and peaceful. His favorite relatives were nearby. It seemed that things would only get better from now on. Henry was pleased with himself. He had done it all. He had succeeded. What he had never dreamed of had come true. On that magical, calm evening, the couple had no idea what trials fate was already preparing for them. It all began the very next year. Louise grew up to kindergarten. The baby got used to preschool surprisingly easily. No caprices and tantrums, no endless illnesses, which frightened young parents of acquaintances. Everything went smoothly. Shelley went to work. She was lucky she was hired as a kitchen assistant in a restaurant. The work was not particularly hard and responsible, and the salary was much higher than that of a janitor. The mortgage payment was a big part of the family's expenses, so the extra money came in handy. Then, in the fall, misfortunes fell upon Shelley and Henry one after another. The blossoming young woman suddenly began to weaken. Dizziness, nausea, loss of appetite. At first, Alan and Shelley assumed pregnancy. Both were afraid they were not yet ready for a second child, primarily financially. The couple realized they couldn't afford it, but there was no question of getting rid of the baby. In general, they gathered their courage and went to the doctor. In the women's counseling, couple was shocked no pregnancy, but Shelley's tests turned out to be alarming. The woman was strongly recommended to be examined by a therapist. Shelley, of course, made an appointment. The examinations took up a lot of her time and energy. She had to constantly take time off from work, which of course did not please her boss. During this period, his wife's eyes were guilty, anxious, and confused. Henry's heart shrank with pity when he looked at his wife. But the man still believed that everything would be all right. A vitamin deficiency or a malfunctioning organ? No problem, they would find the cause, treat it, and everything would be as before. The diagnosis sounded like a thunderclap, the rarest blood disease, presumably hereditary. Shelley couldn't check the doctor's guess. She didn't know anything about her relatives. And what did it matter where the disease came from? The main thing was that the treatment was long, expensive, and there was no guarantee. Doctors with ruthless truthfulness immediately outlined the most likely scenario. Most likely the disease, despite treatment, will progress. All medical manipulations can only briefly delay the inevitable. Shelley was quite resistant to her diagnosis, or maybe she was just pretending to be, braving it for the sake of her husband and son. Henry, on the other hand, felt like he'd been hit over the head with a sandbag. For a long time he felt stunned, completely disoriented. How could it be? Where had the trouble come from all of a sudden? After all, they had just made it out, just started a new life. They had so many plans, so many wonderful ideas. Then Henry came to his senses, accepted the situation, and began to act. First of all, Henry began to look for doctors who had experience in treating patients like his wife. It wasn't cheap, to put it mildly. He had to sell a few things, take out some loans. And then there was the mortgage. Henry was working alone again. Shelley was weakened, and the treatment was taking up most of her time. Louis was happy, not sick, well-behaved, more and more conscious and independent. He understood that Mom was sick, Dad had to work a lot, and learned to serve himself, to dress, cook breakfast, make sandwiches. The little boy grew up before his eyes. People around him praised Louis, setting him as an example to their children. Henry wished all this had never happened. He wished his son didn't know how to tie his shoelaces or make an omelet like other kids his age. Shelley wasn't helped by the medical treatment they could afford. The family went into debt, but it was all for nothing. The young woman was fading, a pale shadow of herself. Henry pounded the thresholds of charitable foundations, tried to get the advice of eminent professors. The latter sometimes succeeded. Only these luminaries of medicine divorced their hands. Shelley's disease was poorly understood, unpredictable. No one knew how to help the young woman. Conventional treatments had little effect on her. Eventually, Shelley was admitted to an inpatient hospital. At that point, she had been sick for about 3 years. The woman couldn't even eat anymore, she was so weak. Henry prepared for a long struggle, even found a nurse who would take care of his wife more carefully for a fee. It didn't work. Shelley didn't live 24 hours after she was admitted to the hospital. Henry couldn't believe what had happened. He was once again experiencing a terrible, unfair loss. The situation was made worse by the fact that the man was now responsible for more than just himself. He had a son. And Louis somehow had to explain that his mother was gone. And then another blow: Henry lost his job. The law firm where he'd worked for the last few years went bankrupt. The owner of the company was always on the edge, taking risks for big profits. So he miscalculated one day. So Henry was also out of a job. After all, during Shelley's illness, the family had accumulated a lot of debts, and the mortgage payment was a heavy burden. Henry found a new job. It paid much less, but there was no other way out. It's not easy to get a good job. That time Henry was lucky to find a high-paying job, or unlucky because his earnings were so unstable. The man worked in the office during the day, and in the evenings he worked part-time. He would help unload a truck at the store, or take part in repairs. Louis was left to his own devices all this time. He did not complain. The boy could always occupy himself. Louis liked to draw. He would take pencils or paints, a sheet of paper, and as if he was disconnected from reality. He went away from the gray reality and created whole worlds with bright rainbows, dense forests, and cute creatures with big eyes, the kind you don't meet in real life. Henry didn't worry about his son going hungry. The main thing was to have something in the refrigerator: bread, sausage, eggs, milk, frozen dumplings. Luis was fine with lunch and dinner. He also fed his father, who was tired after work. That's how they lived. Until it turned out that the apartment was going to the bank for debt. At that time, there were overdue mortgages and loans, so they asked the man and his child to vacate the premises. Henry, as a lawyer, tried to fight for his property. He filed for bankruptcy, tried to explain his plight to people. To no avail. In the end, to avoid the attention of the child welfare authorities, he had to accept it. That's how Henry and Louis ended up at the hostel. James immediately made friends with them. He liked the honest, hard-working Henry. He liked Louis, who was so serious and mature for his 6 years. The three of them became buddies, or even friends, and often had dinner together. James occasionally took Louis for walks. Henry worked a lot, and sitting in a dark hostel was boring for the child. So James took Louis for walks. They talked about everything in the world, discussed different situations, told each other something about themselves. James learned that Louis really wants to become an artist. But the little boy realized that to do that, he had to study. Also, Louis knew that his father did not have money and time to take him to circles or to art school. And that made Louis sad. But the kid did not lose heart, thinking that he would go to the first grade, and there would probably be free classes for students. School was just around the corner, less than a year away. If Louis was looking forward to the start of school with joyful anticipation, his father feared the moment. Because then his and Louis' small homeless family was guaranteed to be on the radar of the child welfare authorities. A child should have a home, a workplace, a bed. And little Louis is living in a hostel. Basically, he's wandering around with his homeless father. Of course, no one's going to leave the boy with a loser parent. They'll take him to an orphanage. Henry knew all too well what it was like there. Shelley had told him enough for the man to try his best to avoid the same scenario for his own child. Except he didn't have the strength, and there was no help. Henry was willing to work, to toil at several jobs, which he actually did. But all these efforts did not bring the desired result. It was still a long way from buying his own place. Henry had some savings, but not enough for even a fraction of the down payment. In short, the situation was desperate. James cringed at the icy wind, or at the sudden rush of thoughts, memories. It wasn't a gentle fall, more like winter. The snow would fall. It would become brighter, more beautiful, softer. Little Louise was looking forward to the new year, to receive presents, to sit at the festive table, to make a wish. He's an adult now. Louise is independent. But still a child, still quite a boy, sincerely believed that the wish made under the chimes would come true. And James knew perfectly well what he would ask Santa Claus or someone else for. In fact, he knew exactly what little Louis was wishing for. The boy would ask for an apartment for him and his dad, and an art school for himself. It's just a shame none of those things will come true anytime soon. James is going to get Louis something he'll love. Already picked up a young artist's kit at the store. Expensive, of course, but nothing's too good for Louis. A suitcase, an easel with a set of paints, pencils, and felt-tip pens. The anticipation of Louis's eyes lighting up at the sight of this splendor made James feel warm. It was so nice to please the people around him, and the children twice as much. But this miracle suitcase would not solve the problems of the little boy and his father, only partially brighten up the gray everyday life of the child. At least that's it. James finally climbed from the bridge to the embankment. Now he was walking along the parapet, in a hurry to get to work. There was no way he could be late. Henry valued him, among other things, for his diligence and reliability. He didn't want to let the man down. And then James noticed that people were standing by the lantern. Men and women, teenagers, children. They were talking excitedly, some were making phone calls, some were filming something on their phones. James followed the gazes of these people. He was stunned. He had never expected to see such a thing. In the dark waves of the wide river, 50 meters from the shore, there was something, or rather, someone. A human head emerged from under the water and then disappeared again. This someone was drowning. He had no strength left. There was no time to speculate about how the man had gotten into the river at a time like this. James, not giving himself time to think over the desperate act, had already swung over the parapet. The man sped across the strip of beach, sand packed into his sneakers, rolled up his pants. The man ran to the water's edge, threw off his jacket, sweater, shoes. It's all heavier. In the cold waves of the river, it would be extra ballast. James was an excellent swimmer. The river was very close to his village. As a child, he used to spend days there with the local boys, swimming and diving and just splashing and frolicking. James, at 5 or 6 years old, felt like a fish in water. Such a pun. But of course, the man never went into the river in this weather. Cold wind and a strong current. And he'd never rescued a drowning man before. But James realized that if he didn't try to pull this man out, no one would help him. And then how to live with it. He had to at least try. The man very well imagined now the despair of a drowning man. There are so many people around, but they are all just watching. Someone's calling the rescue team. Will they make it in time? It's a matter of seconds. The icy water burned his feet. James shivered, but stepped forward. He knew it would be cold at first, and then his body would adapt. And so it did. And now the man is already approaching the drowning man with powerful rows. It is hard to swim strong current, wind, and there is a lot of garbage in the water. Some branches, snags, tuna, elderly fangs of algae. James had less and less strength, but he could see his goal. A head of dark hair, he was close enough to get a good look at the person. It appeared to be a young girl, or even a child. Pale face, eyes black with despair and horror. The drowning woman was struggling for life with her last strength. She must have been a good swimmer, or she would have gone under long ago. But in any case, if James didn't hurry, she would. Finally, the man was close by. He swam up behind the girl. A needed knowledge rose from somewhere from the depths of memory. Drowning people in a desperate attempt to survive are even capable of drowning their saviors. That's why James kept his distance. Good thing the girl had long hair. James grabbed hold of it and swam to the shore. The girl felt help coming. At first, she wanted to reach for James to claw at him, but he wouldn't let go. Then the girl sort of realized what was happening, even relaxed a little and let herself be pulled out. Yeah, she wasn't going to be able to handle the current alone. The girl seemed very thin, almost transparent. Already on the shore, silently looking into the face of her rescuer, the poor girl lost consciousness. Here they were already waiting. Someone wrapped James in a plaid. Someone else covered the girl. An ambulance siren wailed in the distance. The man looked around and realized everything was going to be okay now. Only then his hands trembled, and for some reason his teeth chattered. Whether it was the cold or the fear, James had almost lost the girl, and he might not have made it out at this water temperature. The focus of everyone's attention shifted to the girl. The doctors arrived, and from somewhere came an anxious tall man dressed in an expensive leather jacket. It seemed to be the girl's father. At least they both had the same hazel-colored eyes, dark blonde hair, large nose, and defined cheekbones. James didn't wait for the story to unfold. He dressed quickly and hurried to Henry's office. Surely the boss would accept his tardiness when James told him the reason. But Henry was late that day, so he didn't even have to explain himself. James was hurrying to the store to buy milk, and the next morning, when a man called out to him, he turned around slowly and met his gaze with the familiar hazel eyes. In front of him was a man in a stylish leather jacket. The girl's father, who had somehow ended up in the water that day. "I finally found you," the man smiled, holding out his hand to James. "It wasn't easy. My name is Bob. I'm the father of the teenager you rescued." "Hello," James muttered. He knew the man wanted to thank him. James was anxious to know what had happened to the girl, what her condition was now, how she had gotten into the water. All these days the man thought a lot about the rescued girl. "I wanted to believe that she was okay." Thanks to social media, the man continued. One of the people who were on the embankment at the time posted a video. "This video clearly shows you saving my Tara. A brave thing to do. Desperate. There aren't many people like you these days. And how lucky you were there when you did." "How's the girl?" James asked. "Tara's fine. She's in rehab right now," Bob said. "So she's physically hurt?" "Not really. Just a little cold. That's the other thing. Do you know how she ended up in the river? Did you see that moment?" James shook his head no. All because of unrequited love. She fell in love with some boy, and he started dating someone else. Tara got herself worked up, that's all. She's in counseling now. She's under observation, and she's on the mend. In fact, as it turns out, she realized right away what a stupid thing she'd done. Right after she got in the icy water. It was too late if it hadn't been for you. "The important thing is that everything's okay now," James smiled. "That's true. Her impulse was accidental. I think this situation taught your girl a lot." "It taught me a lot," Bob admitted. "For years in business, I thought there were no good, selfless people who would do what you do. I became cynical, cold, callous. Your act taught me a lot and made me rethink all my values. I've changed a lot." James nodded. "What can I say? I want to thank you. I have opportunities. I know you live in a hostel. You don't have your own place. Ask for anything you want, anything at all. People like you deserve a better fate." James thought for a moment. He remembered Henry's worried eyes when he received his notice from the guardianship authorities, and he remembered little Louis talking excitedly about his dream of becoming an artist. "My life suits me just fine," James said at last. "But there is one person, a little person, who could use your help." He smiled and spread his arms out to catch the boy, hugging him as he liked. "I won first place in the town drawing contest with my drawing of space. Remember I showed it to you?" "Of course I remember." "I told you this would happen," Henry answered. They agreed to go for a walk in the park that Sunday afternoon. Louis liked to run along the paved paths, feed the ducks in the pond, and watch the funny girls. And James and Henry liked to sit at the local cafe, where they cooked flavorful, melt-in-your-mouth kebabs. A little over a year had passed since that conversation with Bob. The wealthy businessman had been amazed at James's request. After all, he had not asked for himself but wanted to help his friend with a small child, two people in desperate straits. Bob bought Henry a one-room apartment, but in a new building in a good neighborhood, near the gymnasium and, importantly, the art school. Henry enrolled Louis in it at the first opportunity. From then on, the boy's talent developed rapidly. His drawings became more and more professional and correct, but at the same time did not lose their uniqueness and spontaneity. Of course, Bob could not help but do something for James personally, although he did not ask him to do so. First, the businessman bought an apartment next to Henry and Louis. They became neighbors, not hostile tenants. Secondly, Bob gave his daughter's savior a high-paying job as a gardener. James had always enjoyed tinkering in the ground, tending to the plants. This was where he belonged. Tara, Bob's daughter, shunned the new gardener for some reason. She was probably afraid of the memories of him. But then they became friends. The girl, as it turned out, regretted her action and now, after a while, could not explain even to herself how she had dared to do such a thing. Sometimes James looked at the tall, thin, touching Tara, and his heart sank at the thought of what would have happened if he hadn't pulled her out of the water. Henry and James walked slowly down the parkway. Ahead of them on his scooter rolled a happy Lewis. "Oh, there you are. I thought you were waiting for me at the fountain." James turned around, smiled, and hurried toward Olivia, a short woman with piercing blue eyes. They had only met recently, but it was already clear that they were serious. Today they'd agreed to go out for a fun, boisterous group of people. It was going to be a wonderful day.